On April 26, 121 CE, in the bustling heart of Rome, a child was born who would one day command the largest empire the world had ever known. Marcus Annius Verus entered the world during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, in a Rome that stretched from the windswept highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt. The infant's first cries echoed through the marble halls of a palatial residence on the Caelian Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills, where the wealthy Annius family had established their ancestral home. The Annius family represented the pinnacle of Roman aristocratic society. Marcus's father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, held the prestigious rank of praetor and could trace his lineage back through generations of distinguished public servants. The family's wealth derived from vast agricultural estates scattered across Spain, where olive groves and wheat fields generated the fortune that supported their luxurious lifestyle in the capital. His paternal grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus the Elder, had served as consul twice and prefect of the city, positions that placed him among the most powerful men in the empire. The influence of Marcus's mother, Domitia Lucilla, proved equally significant in shaping the future emperor's character. She descended from the prominent Domitii family, whose members had served as senators, consuls, and military commanders for centuries. Domitia Lucilla possessed not only aristocratic breeding, but also considerable intellectual gifts, speaking fluent Greek and maintaining correspondence with philosophers and poets throughout the Mediterranean world. Her family controlled extensive brick-making operations that supplied construction projects across Rome, including some of Hadrian's ambitious architectural ventures. When Marcus was barely 3 years old, tragedy struck the household. His father died suddenly, leaving the young boy in the care of his mother and grandfather. This early loss profoundly influenced Marcus's development, instilling in him a precocious awareness of mortality and the transient nature of human affairs. His grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus the Elder, stepped into the paternal role with dedication and wisdom that would leave lasting marks on his grandson's character. The elder Annius Verus embodied the traditional Roman virtues of gravitas, dignitas, and pietas. He rose before dawn each day to attend to his correspondence and legal matters, often taking young Marcus with him to observe the conduct of serious business. The grandfather's study, lined with scrolls containing the works of Cicero, Livy, and other classical authors, became Marcus's first classroom. Here, surrounded by the musty scent of papyrus and the soft scratch of stylus on wax tablet, the boy learned to read and write in both Latin and Greek. The household maintained strict routines that reflected aristocratic values and expectations. Breakfast consisted of bread, honey, and diluted wine, consumed while discussing the day's agenda and reviewing lessons from the previous day. Marcus learned early that privilege carried responsibility, observing as his grandfather received clients seeking legal advice, financial assistance, or political support. These morning audiences, conducted in the atrium beneath painted frescoes depicting family ancestors, provided practical education in leadership and civic duty. Physical training formed an essential component of Marcus's early education. Roman aristocrats considered athletic prowess crucial for future military and political leadership. Under the guidance of skilled trainers, Marcus learned to ride horses, handle weapons, and engage in wrestling matches with other boys from prominent families. The family's private gymnasium, equipped with bronze weights and practice weapons, witnessed daily sessions that developed both physical strength and competitive spirit. The cultural atmosphere of Hadrian's Rome provided an intellectually stimulating environment for a precocious child. The emperor himself embodied Greek learning and philosophical inquiry, encouraging artistic and intellectual pursuits throughout the empire. Greek tutors, many of them freed slaves who had received exceptional educations, served in wealthy households across the city. Marcus's family employed several such tutors, each specializing in different subjects essential for aristocratic education. Grammar and rhetoric formed the foundation of Marcus's formal studies. His Greek tutor, a learned man from Athens named Diognetus, introduced him to Homer's epic poems, Plato's dialogues, and the historical works of Herodotus and Thucydides. These texts were not merely read but memorized, analyzed, and debated. Marcus learned to parse complex grammatical constructions, identify rhetorical devices, and construct persuasive arguments on assigned topics. The boy demonstrated exceptional facility with languages, quickly mastering the nuances of Greek syntax and developing an appreciation for the subtle differences between various dialects. Mathematics and geometry received equal attention in Marcus's curriculum. Roman education emphasized practical applications of mathematical knowledge, preparing students for careers in engineering, architecture, or military logistics. Marcus learned to calculate areas and volumes, construct geometric figures with compass and straight edge, and solve problems involving proportions and ratios. These skills would later prove valuable in understanding siege warfare, urban planning, and economic administration. Music and poetry rounded out Marcus's cultural education. He learned to play the lyre, an instrument considered essential for cultivated gentlemen, and studied the principles of musical harmony and rhythm. Poetry lessons involved not only reading classical works but also composing original verses in both Latin and Greek. Marcus showed particular aptitude for elegiac couplets and developed a lifelong appreciation for the emotional power of carefully crafted language. The turning point in Marcus's intellectual development occurred around his 12th birthday when he encountered Junius Rusticus, a senator and philosopher who had become his most influential mentor. Rusticus belonged to the Stoic philosophical tradition, which emphasized virtue, reason, and acceptance of fate as the keys to human happiness. Unlike many aristocratic Romans who treated philosophy as intellectual decoration, Rusticus lived according to Stoic principles, maintaining equanimity in political setbacks and personal disappointments. Rusticus introduced Marcus to the writings of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the most respected Stoic teachers of the previous generation. Epictetus's teachings, preserved in lecture notes compiled by his student Arrian, presented philosophy not as abstract speculation but as practical guidance for daily living. The core Stoic doctrine that individuals could control their responses to events, even when they could not control the events themselves, resonated deeply with the young Marcus. Under Rusticus's guidance, Marcus began keeping a philosophical journal, recording thoughts about virtue, duty, and the proper conduct of life. These early writings, though lost to history, provided the foundation for the mature philosophical reflections that would eventually become known as the Meditations. Rusticus emphasized the importance of self-examination and honest assessment of one's motives and actions, practices that became lifelong habits for Marcus. The relationship between teacher and student extended beyond formal philosophical instruction. Rusticus served as a model of how to integrate philosophical principles with practical responsibilities. As a serving senator, he demonstrated how Stoic ideals could guide political decision-making without compromising effectiveness or pragmatism. Marcus observed how his mentor maintained dignity during heated Senate debates, showed compassion toward political opponents, and accepted both praise and criticism with equal composure. Emperor Hadrian first noticed Marcus during a religious ceremony at the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. The 12-year-old boy, dressed in the purple-striped toga of aristocratic youth, caught the emperor's attention through his serious demeanour and respectful behaviour during the lengthy ritual proceedings. While other children fidgeted or whispered among themselves, Marcus remained focused on the ceremony, following each ritual gesture with evident understanding and reverence. Hadrian, renowned for his keen judgment of character and intellectual gifts, made inquiries about the boy's background and education. Reports from Marcus's tutors impressed the emperor with accounts of exceptional academic progress and moral development. The boy's compositions in both Latin and Greek demonstrated not only technical proficiency, but also unusual maturity of thought and expression. More significantly, servants and family members consistently described Marcus as kind, honest, and considerate in his daily interactions. The emperor's interest in Marcus reflected broader concerns about imperial succession. Hadrian had no biological sons, and his previous choice of heir, Lucius Aelius Caesar, suffered from poor health that raised questions about his ability to rule effectively. The emperor understood that the stability of the empire depended on smooth transitions of power, requiring careful preparation of future leaders from an early age. During this period, Marcus formed a crucial friendship with Lucius Ceionius Commodus, son of Hadrian's designated heir Lucius Aelius Caesar. The two boys, nearly the same age, shared tutors and participated in joint educational activities designed to prepare them for future responsibilities. Lucius, who would later be renamed Lucius Verus, possessed a more outgoing personality than the serious-minded Marcus, but the differences in temperament created a complementary relationship that would endure throughout their lives. Their friendship developed through shared experiences in the imperial court and aristocratic social circles. Both boys attended state ceremonies, religious festivals, and cultural events, where they observed the conduct of government and the behaviour expected of future leaders. They practiced public speaking together, debated philosophical questions, and engaged in competitive athletic activities that built both physical skills and mutual respect. The philosophical circles that surrounded Rusticus and other Stoic teachers provided Marcus with intellectual companionship beyond his peer relationships. These gatherings, held in private homes or garden settings, brought together senators, equestrians, and other educated Romans interested in serious philosophical discussion. Marcus, despite his youth, participated actively in these conversations, asking thoughtful questions and offering observations that demonstrated his growing understanding of Stoic principles. These philosophical associations exposed Marcus to diverse perspectives within the Stoic tradition. Some participants emphasized the school's political dimensions, arguing that Stoic principles provided the best foundation for just governance and effective leadership. Others focused on personal ethics and individual development, viewing philosophy primarily as a guide for private conduct rather than public policy. Marcus absorbed these different approaches, developing a synthetic understanding that would later inform his approach to imperial administration. The intellectual ferment of Hadrian's court encouraged Marcus's developing interest in literature, history, and natural philosophy. The emperor's personal library, one of the largest private collections in the ancient world, became accessible to the promising young aristocrat. Marcus spent countless hours reading historical accounts of previous emperors, studying military treatises and examining philosophical works from various schools of thought. His reading extended beyond traditional Roman and Greek authors to include works from the eastern provinces of the empire. Marcus encountered Stoic writings from Asia Minor, Platonic texts from Alexandria, and even some exposure to ideas from India and Persia that had filtered into the Mediterranean intellectual world through trade and diplomatic contacts. This broad exposure to diverse philosophical traditions contributed to the cosmopolitan outlook that would characterize his later reign. Physical training continued to play an important role in Marcus's development during these formative years. Roman military traditions required emperors to demonstrate personal courage and competence in warfare, making martial skills essential for political legitimacy. Marcus learned swordplay from experienced gladiatorial trainers, practiced archery with composite bows used by auxiliary cavalry units, and studied siege engineering through scale models and mathematical calculations. Hunting expeditions provided opportunities to apply military skills in practical settings while building relationships with other young aristocrats. These excursions, typically lasting several days, took place on estates outside Rome where participants tracked wild boar, deer, and other game animals. Marcus demonstrated competence rather than exceptional skill in these activities, earning respect through steady performance and good judgment rather than spectacular achievements. The social aspects of aristocratic education proved equally important in preparing Marcus for future leadership responsibilities. He learned to navigate the complex protocols of Roman high society, understanding the subtle distinctions of rank and precedence that governed interactions among the elite. Dinner parties, theatrical performances, and religious ceremonies provided venues for observing and practicing the social skills necessary for effective political leadership. Marcus's reputation for integrity and serious purpose spread throughout aristocratic circles during his teenage years. Unlike many young Romans from wealthy families, he avoided the gambling, drinking, and sexual adventures that typically characterized aristocratic youth culture. Instead, he devoted himself to philosophical study, literary pursuits, and preparation for the responsibilities that seemed increasingly likely to come his way. The combination of exceptional intellectual gifts, moral character, and aristocratic connections positioned Marcus uniquely within the imperial court. His philosophical interests aligned with Hadrian's own intellectual pursuits, while his family background provided the social credentials necessary for acceptance among the traditional Roman elite. Most importantly, his demonstrated commitment to duty and service suggested the temperament required for effective imperial leadership. As Marcus approached his 17th birthday, the foundations of his character and worldview had been firmly established through the influences of family, tutors, and the broader cultural environment of Hadrian's Rome. The serious, thoughtful young man who emerged from this formative period possessed the intellectual tools, moral principles, and social connections that would soon propel him toward the pinnacle of imperial power. The death of Emperor Hadrian on July 10th, 138 CE, marked the beginning of the most transformative period in Marcus's young life. As the imperial funeral procession wound through Rome's streets, with professional mourners wailing and incense burning in elaborate bronze censers, 17-year-old Marcus stood among the imperial family members, acutely aware that his destiny was about to change dramatically. The new emperor, Antoninus Pius, had received Hadrian's final instructions regarding the succession, instructions that would elevate Marcus from a promising young aristocrat to the heir apparent of the Roman Empire. Antoninus Pius, born Titus Aurelius Fulvus, Boionius Arius Antoninus, had served as consul and governed the province of Asia with distinction before Hadrian selected him as successor. At 51 years old, he possessed the administrative experience and steady temperament that Hadrian believed necessary for imperial leadership. More crucially for Marcus's future, Antoninus had agreed to adopt both Marcus and Lucius Ceionius Commodus, the son of Hadrian's deceased first choice for heir, as part of the succession arrangement. The formal adoption ceremony took place in the Campus Martius, before a gathering of senators, magistrates, and representatives from throughout the empire. Marcus, dressed in a pristine white toga with a narrow purple stripe of equestrian rank, stood beside Antoninus as the emperor recited the ancient legal formulas that would make him a member of the Antonine family. The ceremony transformed Marcus Annius Verus into Marcus Aurelius Aurelius Verus, linking him legally and dynastically to the imperial house while preserving connections to his birth family through the retention of his original cognomen. The adoption brought immediate changes to Marcus's daily routine and living arrangements. He moved from his family's residence on the Caelian Hill to apartments within the imperial palace complex on the Palatine Hill, a sprawling collection of interconnected buildings that had grown organically over the centuries as successive emperors added their own architectural contributions. Marcus's new quarters, decorated with frescoes depicting mythological scenes and furnished with tables of rare marble and bronze, reflected his elevated status, while maintaining the relative simplicity that characterized Antoninus's household management style. Antoninus Pius approached Marcus's education with the systematic thoroughness that had marked his own rise through the imperial bureaucracy. Rather than relying solely on private tutors and philosophical discussions, The emperor insisted that his adopted son gain practical experience in the actual mechanics of Roman governance. Marcus began attending meetings of the imperial council, where he observed discussions of provincial administration, military logistics, legal disputes, and financial planning that affected millions of people across 3 continents. These council sessions, held in a marble-lined chamber overlooking the Circus Maximus, provided Marcus with unprecedented insight into the complexities of imperial decision-making. He watched as Antoninus balanced competing demands from provincial governors seeking additional troops, senators advocating for public works projects in their home regions, and military commanders requesting resources for frontier defence. The emperor's patient consideration of multiple perspectives and his insistence on thorough investigation before reaching decisions became models that Marcus would later emulate in his own reign. The administrative apprenticeship extended beyond passive observation to active participation in governmental functions. Antoninus assigned Marcus to review petitions from individuals and communities seeking imperial intervention in local disputes, tax assessments, and legal matters. These documents, written on papyrus scrolls and delivered by official couriers from provinces as distant as Britain and Egypt, exposed Marcus to the diverse challenges facing imperial subjects and the practical limitations of central authority in addressing local problems. Marcus's work with petitions revealed the human dimension of imperial governance that philosophical treatises could not convey. A request from a veteran seeking land grants in Pannonia, a complaint from merchants about corrupt tax collectors in Gaul, or an appeal from a provincial city requesting funds to repair earthquake damage, required not only legal knowledge but also understanding of economic conditions, military requirements, and political sensitivities that varied dramatically across the empire's vast territories. The emperor's approach to Marcus's military education reflected similar attention to practical preparation rather than theoretical study. While Marcus continued physical training with weapons and horses, Antoninus arranged for him to spend time with experienced centurions and military engineers who could explain the realities of campaign logistics, siege warfare, and troop management. These sessions, conducted in the Campus Martius training grounds where the Praetorian Guard maintained their barracks, provided hands-on experience with military equipment and tactical planning. Marcus learned to evaluate terrain for defensive advantages, calculate supply requirements for marching armies, and understand the engineering principles behind the construction of temporary fortifications and siege engines. A grizzled centurion named Gaius Valerius Maximus, who had served in campaigns along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, became particularly influential in developing Marcus's appreciation for the practical challenges facing Roman military commanders. Maximus emphasized that successful generals needed to understand not only strategy and tactics, but also the daily concerns of ordinary soldiers regarding food, equipment, medical care, and communication with families. The integration into imperial household routines brought Marcus into regular contact with the extensive network of freedmen, slaves, and administrative personnel who actually managed the day-to-day operations of the empire. He learned to work with the imperial secretaries who handled correspondence with provincial governors, the financial officers who tracked tax revenues and expenditures, and the legal experts who drafted edicts and responded to judicial appeals from throughout the Mediterranean world. These relationships taught Marcus valuable lessons about the importance of competent subordinates and effective delegation of authority. He observed how Antoninus maintained personal oversight of major policy decisions while relying on trusted assistants to handle routine administrative matters. The emperor's practice of meeting regularly with department heads to review progress and address problems provided Marcus with a model for managing large, complex organizations that would prove essential during his own reign. The year 139 CE brought Marcus's first major public responsibility when Antoninus appointed him to serve as consul, despite his youth and relative inexperience in traditional magistracies. The consulship, though largely ceremonial by this period, still carried significant prestige and provided opportunities for public speaking and ceremonial leadership that helped establish Marcus's credentials with the Roman elite. His consular year required him to preside over Senate meetings, participate in religious ceremonies, and represent imperial authority at various public events throughout Rome. Marcus's performance as consul impressed observers with his serious preparation and respectful demeanour towards senatorial traditions. Unlike some young aristocrats who treated magistracies as stepping stones to greater power, Marcus demonstrated genuine interest in understanding the historical significance and constitutional functions of the offices he held. He studied the records of distinguished consuls from earlier periods, learning how they had balanced respect for tradition with adaptation to changing circumstances. The consulship also provided Marcus with his first sustained exposure to the Roman Senate as an institution and political arena. He learned to navigate the complex dynamics of senatorial politics, understanding which members commanded genuine influence based on experience and character, which relied primarily on family connections or wealth, and which represented particular regional or factional interests. These insights proved invaluable in developing the political skills necessary for effective imperial leadership. During this period, arrangements began for Marcus's marriage to Annia Galeria Faustina, known as Faustina the Younger, daughter of Antoninus Pius and his deceased wife Faustina the Elder. The marriage, planned as part of the dynastic arrangements established by Hadrian, would strengthen Marcus's position within the imperial family, while continuing the Antonine line through any children the union might produce. Faustina, approximately 4 years younger than Marcus, had received the education typical of aristocratic Roman women, including instruction in literature, music, household management, and the social skills necessary for imperial court life. The betrothal ceremony, conducted according to ancient Roman customs, took place in the imperial palace with members of both families present, along with selected senators and other dignitaries. Marcus, now 18 years old and beginning to show the physical maturity that would characterize his adult appearance, wore a toga praetexta with purple borders signifying his elevated status. Faustina appeared in a white stola decorated with gold embroidery, her hair arranged in the elaborate style favoured by imperial women and adorned with pearls from the Red Sea fisheries. The formal wedding celebration in 145 CE demonstrated the wealth and ceremonial sophistication of the Antonine court. The ceremony began at dawn with religious rituals conducted by the Pontifex Maximus, followed by the exchange of vows in the presence of hundreds of guests representing the highest levels of Roman society. The wedding feast, held in the palace's largest dining hall, featured delicacies imported from throughout the empire, including oysters from Britain, wine from the Rhine Valley, spices from India, and silk garments from China. Marcus approached marriage with the same serious sense of duty that characterized his attitude toward other responsibilities. He understood that his relationship with Faustina carried political and dynastic implications beyond personal happiness. But he also sought to build a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to family welfare. Contemporary sources suggest that the marriage, while arranged for political purposes, developed into a relationship of considerable affection and mutual support. The early years of Marcus's marriage were marked by both joy and tragedy as Faustina bore a succession of children, many of whom died in infancy or early childhood. Their first child, a daughter named Annia Aurelia Galeria Faustina, was born in 147 CE, but survived only a few months. Subsequent pregnancies produced both sons and daughters, though the high infant mortality rates typical of the ancient world meant that only a few would reach adulthood. The deaths of his children profoundly affected Marcus's philosophical development and emotional maturity. Each loss reinforced Stoic teachings about the transient nature of human attachments and the importance of accepting fate with dignity and composure. Marcus's private writings from this period, preserved in fragmentary form, reveal his struggle to reconcile paternal love with philosophical acceptance of mortality. These personal experiences with grief and loss would later inform his approach to imperial leadership during times of crisis and tragedy. Faustina's role extended beyond childbearing to include active participation in court ceremonies and public appearances that helped establish the imperial family's connection with Roman society. She accompanied Marcus to religious festivals, theatrical performances, and charitable events that demonstrated imperial concern for public welfare. Her presence at these occasions, dressed in silk garments and accompanied by a retinue of attendants, reinforced the majesty and continuity of imperial authority, while providing opportunities for ordinary Romans to see their future rulers. The imperial household during Antoninus's reign maintained a relatively modest lifestyle, compared to the extravagances associated with some earlier emperors. Antoninus preferred simple meals, practical clothing, and restrained entertainment that reflected traditional Roman values, rather than the Greek-influenced luxury that had characterized Hadrian's court. This atmosphere influenced Marcus's own preferences and provided a model of imperial dignity that avoided both excessive austerity and ostentatious display. Marcus's philosophical education continued throughout this period under the guidance of several distinguished teachers who expanded his understanding beyond the Stoic tradition. Apollonius of Chalcedon, a renowned rhetorician, refined Marcus's public speaking skills and taught him to craft persuasive arguments that could influence diverse audiences. Sextus of Chaeronea, grandson of the famous biographer Plutarch, introduced him to Platonic philosophy and helped him understand the relationships between different schools of ancient thought. The most significant philosophical influence during Marcus's apprenticeship years came from Junius Rusticus, who continued to serve as both mentor and friend despite his advancing age. Rusticus introduced Marcus to the personal writings of Epictetus, including lecture notes and private correspondence that revealed the practical application of Stoic principles to daily challenges. These texts, written in clear, direct language without academic pretension, resonated deeply with Marcus's preference for philosophical guidance that addressed real-world problems rather than abstract speculation. Under Rusticus's direction, Marcus began developing the systematic approach to self-examination and moral reflection that would eventually produce his famous Meditations. He established daily routines of philosophical contemplation, typically conducted in the early morning hours before official duties began, when he could reflect on Stoic teachings and their application to his own conduct and responsibilities. These sessions involved not only reading classical texts, but also writing personal observations and reminders that helped reinforce philosophical principles. The philosophical discussions that took place in Rusticus's home attracted other serious students of Stoicism, including senators, equestrians, and educated freedmen who shared interests in practical ethics and rational approaches to human problems. Marcus participated actively in these conversations, contributing insights drawn from his unique perspective as heir to imperial power, while learning from others who brought different experiences and viewpoints to philosophical questions. These intellectual associations exposed Marcus to ongoing debates within the Stoic tradition about the proper relationship between philosophical principles and political action. Some participants argued that true philosophers should withdraw from public life to focus on personal virtue and spiritual development, while others maintained that Stoic principles obligated capable individuals to serve their communities through active engagement in governance and military service. Marcus's own position, influenced by his imperial destiny, favoured the latter view, while acknowledging the tensions between philosophical ideals and practical political necessities. The progression of Marcus's official responsibilities accelerated during the 150s, as Antoninus gradually transferred more authority to his designated successor. In 147 CE, Marcus received tribunician power, the constitutional foundation of imperial authority that granted him the right to propose legislation, veto senatorial actions, and exercise judicial functions. This appointment, unprecedented for someone who had not yet held the praetorship, reflected Antoninus's confidence in Marcus's abilities and his commitment to ensuring a smooth succession. The tribunician power brought Marcus into direct involvement with legislative processes and judicial appeals that affected millions of imperial subjects. He learned to evaluate proposed laws for their practical implications and constitutional compatibility, considering not only immediate effects but also long-term consequences for imperial administration and social stability. His approach to these responsibilities reflected both his philosophical training and his practical experience with governmental operations, emphasizing careful deliberation and consultation with experts before reaching decisions. Marcus's growing authority also included military responsibilities. Though Antoninus's reign was marked by relative peace along most imperial frontiers, he participated in planning sessions for frontier defense, reviewed reports from provincial commanders, and studied the strategic challenges facing Roman forces in Britain, Germany, and the eastern provinces. These activities provided essential preparation for the military crises that would dominate his own reign, though the full extent of future challenges remained hidden during the peaceful years of Antonine rule. The administrative experience gained during this apprenticeship period proved invaluable in developing Marcus's understanding of imperial governance complexities. He learned to balance competing demands from different provinces and interest groups, to evaluate the reliability of information received from distant sources, and to make decisions based on incomplete knowledge under time pressures that prevented thorough investigation. These skills, acquired through years of practical experience under Antoninus's guidance, would prove essential during the military and political crises of his own reign. By the late 150s, Marcus had evolved from a promising young aristocrat into a capable administrator and designated imperial successor, whose abilities commanded respect throughout the Roman elite. His combination of philosophical depth, practical experience, and personal integrity positioned him to assume the full responsibilities of imperial leadership when circumstances would eventually require the transition from apprentice to emperor. The morning of March 7th, 161 CE, dawned grey and cold over Rome, with a bitter wind sweeping down from the Alban hills that seemed to carry omens of change. Within the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Emperor Antoninus Pius lay dying in his private chambers, his breathing shallow and laboured after several days of declining health. The 74-year-old emperor, who had ruled with unprecedented stability and prosperity for nearly 23 years, was finally succumbing to the fever that had gripped him since returning from his villa at Laurium. Marcus Aurelius, now 39 years old and bearing the weathered features of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment, maintained a vigil beside the imperial bed alongside other members of the imperial household. The death of Antoninus Pius occurred without the dramatic final speeches or deathbed revelations that characterized the passing of some earlier emperors. Instead, the emperor simply closed his eyes during the afternoon hours and ceased breathing, his face maintaining the serene expression that had marked his approach to both life and governance. Marcus, who had been reading correspondence from provincial governors while waiting for any change in the emperor's condition, immediately set aside his documents and began the carefully orchestrated process of imperial transition that had been planned for years. The immediate hours following Antoninus's death revealed the effectiveness of the succession arrangements that had been established during Marcus's long apprenticeship. Palace officials, led by the Praetorian prefect and senior freedmen of the imperial household, moved swiftly to secure the building and notify key military commanders and government officials of the emperor's passing. Marcus, drawing upon his extensive experience with imperial administration, took personal charge of coordinating these activities while maintaining the calm demeanour that would be essential for ensuring stability during the transition period. The formal announcement of Antoninus's death and Marcus's succession took place that evening in the Praetorian camp, where the elite guards who protected the emperor and maintained order in Rome had assembled to hear the news. Marcus appeared before the assembled soldiers wearing the purple cloak that symbolized imperial authority, his tall frame and greying beard lending gravitas to the moment. The Praetorians, who had known Marcus for years through his involvement in palace affairs, acclaimed him as emperor without hesitation, their shouts echoing off the stone walls of the camp's assembly hall. The Senate's formal recognition of Marcus's imperial authority followed the next morning in a session convened in the Curia Julia, the marble-faced building where Rome's most prestigious political body conducted its business. Senators who had worked with Marcus during his years as heir apparent spoke in favour of his elevation, praising his administrative experience, philosophical wisdom, and demonstrated commitment to continuing the policies that had brought peace and prosperity to the empire. The unanimous vote confirming Marcus as emperor reflected both genuine respect for his qualifications and practical recognition that the succession had been inevitable for years. Marcus's first major decision as emperor proved to be one of his most controversial and historically significant choices. Rather than assuming sole imperial authority in the traditional manner, he announced his intention to share power with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother and longtime companion, who would serve as co-emperor with equal constitutional authority. This unprecedented arrangement shocked many senators and court officials who had expected Marcus to follow conventional precedent by ruling alone while designating Lucius as his eventual successor. The decision to establish a dual emperorship reflected Marcus's philosophical conviction that effective governance required recognition of human limitations and the distribution of responsibilities among capable individuals. His years of administrative experience had taught him that the empire's vast territories and complex challenges exceeded the capacity of any single ruler to manage effectively. By sharing authority with Lucius, who possessed complementary skills in military leadership and diplomatic negotiation, Marcus believed he could provide more effective governance while reducing the personal burden of absolute power that had worn down previous emperors. Lucius Verus, now 30 years old, had spent his adult years preparing for imperial responsibilities through military service and administrative positions that complemented Marcus's more philosophical and judicial focus. Where Marcus excelled in legal reasoning and systematic analysis of complex problems, Lucius demonstrated natural talents for military strategy and the personal charisma that inspired loyalty among soldiers and provincial populations. His experience commanding auxiliary units along the Danube frontier had provided practical knowledge of military logistics and frontier defence that would prove essential in the challenges ahead. The formal ceremony establishing the dual emperorship took place in the Campus Martius, before a gathering that included senators, magistrates, military commanders, and representatives from throughout the empire. Both emperors wore identical purple robes and golden laurel crowns, symbolizing their equal authority, while standing on a raised platform decorated with eagles and military standards that represented Roman power. The ritual distribution of gold coins bearing both imperial portraits to the assembled crowd demonstrated the regime's commitment to maintaining the generous donatives that had characterized Antonine rule. The practical implementation of shared imperial authority required careful negotiation and systematic division of responsibilities between the two emperors. Marcus retained primary oversight of domestic administration, including judicial affairs, financial management, and relations with the Senate and other traditional Roman institutions. His philosophical training and years of experience with legal petitions and administrative procedures made him particularly well suited for these responsibilities, which required patient deliberation and careful attention to precedent and constitutional principles. Lucius assumed primary responsibility for military affairs and foreign relations, areas where his more aggressive temperament and practical experience with frontier conditions provided advantages over Marcus's more contemplative approach. The division of authority extended to geographical spheres of influence, with Lucius taking charge of eastern provinces where tensions with the Parthian Empire required military preparation and diplomatic engagement, while Marcus focused on western and northern frontiers where administrative and economic issues predominated. The early months of the dual emperorship tested the viability of shared authority, as both rulers worked to establish effective coordination mechanisms while maintaining the appearance of unified leadership. Daily meetings between the emperors and their respective advisors became routine, with detailed discussions of policy decisions and careful documentation of agreements to prevent misunderstandings or conflicts. The imperial secretariat, staffed by experienced freedmen who had served under Antoninus, adapted their procedures to accommodate the new arrangement while maintaining the efficiency that had characterized imperial administration for decades. Marcus's approach to imperial authority reflected his deep commitment to Stoic principles and his understanding of power as a burden to be borne for the benefit of others, rather than a privilege to be enjoyed. His private writings from this period reveal ongoing struggles with the moral complexities of absolute authority and the tension between philosophical ideals and practical political necessities. The responsibility for decisions that affected millions of people weighed heavily on his conscience, leading to periods of intense self-examination and philosophical reflection that helped him maintain perspective during difficult moments. The continuation of Antonine policies during the early months of Marcus's reign demonstrated his commitment to preserving the stability and prosperity that had characterized his predecessor's rule. Legal reforms initiated under Antoninus continued their gradual implementation, including measures to improve the treatment of slaves, strengthen the rights of women in property disputes, and standardize judicial procedures across different provinces. These changes reflected the humanitarian impulses that had long characterized Antonine legislation, while maintaining respect for traditional Roman legal principles. Economic policies likewise showed continuity with previous practices, emphasizing fiscal responsibility and careful management of imperial resources. Marcus maintained Antoninus's conservative approach to public expenditure, avoiding the costly building projects and elaborate entertainments that had strained imperial finances under some earlier rulers. Instead, he focused on practical improvements to infrastructure, including road maintenance, harbour facilities, and aqueduct systems that supported commerce and urban development throughout the empire. The administrative machinery of imperial government continued to function smoothly under Marcus's leadership, drawing upon the experienced personnel and established procedures that had evolved during the Antonine period. Provincial governors, many of whom had served under Antoninus, received confirmation of their appointments and clear guidance regarding policy continuity. The imperial correspondence system, managed by skilled secretaries who maintained detailed records of all official communications, ensured that directives from Rome reached distant provinces with accuracy and appropriate urgency. Marcus's personal staff reflected his preference for competent administrators over political appointees or personal favourites. He retained many of the freedmen and equestrian officials who had served Antoninus effectively, while gradually promoting younger men whose abilities had been demonstrated through successful performance in subordinate positions. This approach emphasized merit and experience over social connections or political loyalty, though Marcus remained sensitive to the need for maintaining support among traditional Roman elites. The philosophical dimension of Marcus's approach to imperial leadership became evident in his treatment of petitioners and his handling of judicial appeals that reached the emperor's personal attention. Unlike some rulers who delegated such matters entirely to subordinates, Marcus personally reviewed cases involving constitutional questions, provincial disputes, or appeals from individuals claiming injustice. His careful consideration of legal precedents and his commitment to fair hearings, even for petitioners from humble backgrounds, established a reputation for justice that enhanced imperial legitimacy throughout the Mediterranean world. The early challenges of dual emperorship included managing the expectations of different constituencies who had varying degrees of comfort with the unprecedented power-sharing arrangement. Traditional senators, accustomed to the clear hierarchy of single imperial rule, sometimes struggled to understand which emperor had authority over particular matters, or how to navigate situations where the co-rulers might hold different opinions. Military commanders faced similar uncertainties, particularly regarding chain of command during operations that might involve forces from different regions. Marcus addressed these concerns through systematic communication and the establishment of clear protocols governing the exercise of shared authority. Regular bulletins distributed to provincial governors and military commanders clarified the division of responsibilities and provided guidance for situations requiring imperial authorization. The emperor's practice of issuing joint edicts on major policy questions helped maintain the appearance of unified leadership while allowing each ruler to focus on his areas of particular expertise and interest. The personal relationship between Marcus and Lucius proved crucial to the success of their power-sharing arrangement during these early months. Their long friendship and shared experiences during their preparation for imperial responsibilities provided a foundation of mutual trust and understanding that helped them navigate disagreements and coordinate their activities effectively. Both emperors recognized that public displays of conflict or competition would undermine the stability they sought to maintain, leading them to resolve differences through private discussion rather than public debate. The burden of absolute power manifested itself in Marcus's daily routine and personal habits as he adapted to the relentless demands of imperial leadership. His mornings began before dawn with philosophical meditation and reading, activities that provided mental preparation for the decisions and interactions that would fill his days. The imperial schedule, managed by experienced court officials, included audiences with senators and other dignitaries, review of official correspondence, meetings with military commanders and provincial representatives, and participation in religious ceremonies that maintained the emperor's role as Pontifex Maximus. The weight of responsibility extended beyond official duties to encompass the constant awareness that his words and actions influenced the lives of millions of people across 3 continents. Marcus's philosophical training helped him maintain perspective during moments of overwhelming pressure, but his private writings reveal ongoing anxiety about the moral implications of imperial decisions and the difficulty of reconciling Stoic ideals with the practical necessities of governance. The tension between philosophical principles and political realities would remain a central theme throughout his reign, shaping his approach to both domestic administration and military campaigns. The tranquil early months of Marcus Aurelius's reign came to an abrupt end in the late summer of 161 CE, when urgent dispatches arrived from the eastern provinces bearing news that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the new dual emperorship. The messages, carried by exhausted cavalry messengers who had ridden relay horses across Anatolia and the Balkans, brought reports of massive Parthian military movements along the Euphrates frontier and the complete destruction of a Roman legion in Armenia. The gravity of the situation became clear as additional intelligence reached Rome throughout September, painting a picture of coordinated Parthian aggression that threatened to unravel 2 centuries of Roman dominance in the Near East. King Vologases IV of Parthia, who had ruled the sprawling Iranian Empire for over 2 decades, had apparently decided that the transition of power in Rome presented an opportune moment to challenge Roman hegemony in the contested borderlands between the 2 great powers. The Parthian monarch, operating from his winter capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River, had spent months assembling a massive military coalition that included not only his own heavily armoured cavalry forces, but also contingents from vassal kingdoms throughout Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. Armenian nobles, long resentful of Roman interference in their kingdom's internal affairs, had provided crucial intelligence about Roman troop dispositions and supply routes that enabled Parthian forces to strike with devastating effectiveness. The initial Parthian offensive had focused on Armenia, the mountainous kingdom that had served as a buffer state between the two empires, since the settlement negotiated under Emperor Nero nearly a century earlier. Roman forces stationed in Armenia, consisting primarily of auxiliary units supported by a single legion detachment, found themselves completely outmatched by the scale and coordination of the Parthian assault. The 9th Hispana Legion, which had been transferred from Britain to reinforce the eastern frontier, suffered catastrophic losses in a series of engagements near the fortress city of Artaxata, with surviving centurions reporting that Parthian heavy cavalry had overwhelmed Roman defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers and superior mobility. The destruction of organised Roman resistance in Armenia opened the entire eastern frontier to Parthian penetration, creating a strategic crisis that demanded immediate imperial response. Parthian forces, emboldened by their initial success, began advancing westward into Cappadocia and southward towards Syria, threatening the wealthy commercial cities that generated substantial tax revenues for the imperial treasury. The provincial governor of Syria, Lucius Attidius Cornelianus, sent increasingly desperate appeals for reinforcements, as reports reached Antioch of Parthian raiding parties approaching the Euphrates crossings that protected the province's eastern approaches. The magnitude of the eastern crisis forced Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus to make fundamental decisions about the allocation of imperial resources and the strategic priorities that would guide their response to Parthian aggression. The dual emperors, meeting in emergency session with their military advisors and senior senators, faced the uncomfortable reality that Roman forces in the eastern provinces lacked both the numerical strength and logistical support necessary to contain Parthian advances without substantial reinforcement from European garrisons. The prospect of transferring legions from the Rhine and Danube frontiers raised serious concerns about barbarian opportunism, but the alternative of allowing Parthian conquest of Roman territories in the east appeared even more dangerous to imperial prestige and security. After extensive deliberation with experienced military commanders and careful review of intelligence reports from eastern provinces, the emperors decided that Lucius Verus should personally lead a massive expeditionary force to restore Roman authority in Armenia and Mesopotamia. This decision reflected both practical considerations about military leadership and the constitutional logic of the dual emperorship arrangement. Lucius possessed extensive experience with frontier warfare from his service along the Danube, while his more aggressive temperament and natural charisma made him better suited than the philosophically minded Marcus for the demands of active campaigning in hostile territory. The appointment of Lucius Verus as supreme commander of eastern operations represented an unprecedented delegation of military authority that tested the practical viability of shared imperial power. Marcus retained overall strategic oversight and responsibility for coordinating logistical support from Rome, but Lucius received complete tactical autonomy to conduct military operations as circumstances required. This arrangement necessitated the development of new communication protocols and command structures that could accommodate the geographical separation between the co-emperors while maintaining unified strategic direction. The mobilization effort required to support Lucius Verus's eastern expedition demonstrated the impressive organizational capabilities that Roman military administration had developed over centuries of frontier warfare. Legions stationed in Pannonia, Moesia, and Germania received orders to prepare selected cohorts for transfer to eastern staging areas, while auxiliary units from throughout the European provinces contributed specialized troops including archers, cavalry, and siege engineers. The 5th Macedonica Legion, based at Trosmis on the lower Danube, received orders to march in its entirety to Syria, while substantial detachments from the 1st Adiutrix, 2nd Adiutrix, and 14th Gemina legions prepared for deployment to Armenian and Mesopotamian theatres. The logistical challenges of moving and supplying such large military forces across thousands of miles of territory required careful coordination between imperial administrators, provincial governors, and military commanders. Supply depots established at strategic locations along the march routes stockpiled grain, weapons, medical supplies, and other essential materials needed to sustain campaigning armies in the arid regions of the Near East. The imperial fleet based at Misenum and Ravenna received orders to transport heavy equipment and siege engines to eastern Mediterranean ports, while arrangements were made with allied kingdoms and friendly cities to provide local guides, interpreters, and additional supplies. Marcus Aurelius assumed personal responsibility for coordinating the western aspects of this massive military mobilization, while managing the domestic administrative duties that continue to require imperial attention. His daily routine during the autumn of 161 CE involved dawn meetings with military logistics officers, followed by sessions reviewing reports from provincial governors and correspondence with eastern commanders. The emperor's private study, lined with maps depicting the complex geography of the Mesopotamian theatre, became the nerve centre for strategic planning and resource allocation decisions that would determine the success or failure of Roman efforts to restore eastern frontier security. The financial implications of the eastern expedition placed unprecedented strains on imperial resources that had been carefully managed during the peaceful years of Antonine rule. The costs of transporting and supplying multiple legions across vast distances, combined with the need to maintain adequate garrison forces along other frontiers, required expenditures that exceeded normal military budgets by substantial margins. Marcus authorized the release of funds from the imperial treasury's emergency reserves, while implementing new taxation measures designed to generate additional revenues without causing excessive hardship for provincial populations. The departure of Lucius Verus from Rome in the spring of 162 CE marked a ceremonial occasion that demonstrated both imperial determination and public confidence in the success of the Eastern expedition. The co-emperor, wearing gilded armour and mounted on a white charger, led a procession of senior officers and elite guard units through the streets of Rome, while crowds of citizens gathered to witness the spectacle. The ceremony, conducted according to ancient traditions governing military expeditions, included sacrifices at the Temple of Mars Ultor and formal prayers for divine protection of Roman forces in the coming campaigns. Lucius Verus established his headquarters at Antioch, the magnificent Syrian capital whose strategic location and excellent harbour facilities made it an ideal base for coordinating military operations throughout the Eastern Theatre. The city, with its broad colonnaded streets and impressive public buildings, provided accommodations for the expanded imperial staff, while offering access to local merchants and craftsmen who could supply specialized equipment needed for desert warfare. The presence of the co-emperor and his substantial entourage transformed Antioch into a secondary imperial capital, attracting diplomats, intelligence agents, and military contractors from throughout the Mediterranean world. The initial phase of Lucius Verus's Eastern campaign focused on rebuilding Roman military capabilities in Syria and preparing for the systematic reconquest of lost territories in Armenia and Mesopotamia. Arriving Roman legions underwent intensive training in desert warfare techniques, including water conservation, navigation in arid terrain, and coordination with auxiliary cavalry units equipped for rapid movement across vast distances. Local recruitment efforts supplemented European forces with Syrian and Anatolian auxiliaries who possessed knowledge of regional geography and languages essential for effective military operations. The strategic planning for Roman offensive operations required careful consideration of Parthian military capabilities and the geographical challenges posed by campaigning in Mesopotamian terrain. Parthian forces relied heavily on heavily armoured cavalry units, known as cataphracts, supported by horse archers whose mobility and firepower had proven devastatingly effective against Roman infantry formations in previous conflicts. The arid climate and limited water sources of the Mesopotamian theatre created logistical challenges that favoured defenders familiar with local conditions over invading armies dependent on extended supply lines. Roman preparations for the offensive phase of the campaign included the construction of fortified supply bases at strategic locations along projected advance routes, the accumulation of siege equipment necessary for reducing Parthian strongholds, and the development of tactical innovations designed to counter enemy cavalry advantages. Military engineers, drawing upon centuries of Roman experience in siege warfare, designed portable artillery pieces and mobile fortifications that could provide protection for infantry units during engagements in open terrain where Parthian horsemen enjoyed natural advantages. The first major Roman success came in 163 CE, when combined legionary and auxiliary forces under the command of Statius Priscus, an experienced general who had previously served with distinction in Britain, successfully invaded Armenia and restored Roman control over key strategic positions. The campaign, characterized by rapid movement and aggressive pursuit of retreating Parthian forces, culminated in the recapture of Artaxata and the installation of a new Armenian king loyal to Roman interests. The victory demonstrated that proper preparation and competent leadership could overcome the tactical advantages that had enabled initial Parthian successes. The restoration of Roman authority in Armenia provided a secure base for subsequent operations aimed at penetrating Parthian territory in Mesopotamia and striking directly at the centres of enemy power. Lucius Verus, emboldened by the Armenian success and confident in the capabilities of his expanded military forces, authorized ambitious offensive plans designed to carry Roman arms across the Euphrates and establish permanent footholds in territory that had remained under Parthian control for generations. The Mesopotamian offensive, launched in 164 CE under the direct command of Avidius Cassius, a capable general whose aggressive tactics and personal courage had earned him rapid promotion through the military hierarchy, achieved spectacular initial success that exceeded even optimistic Roman expectations. Roman forces, advancing in coordinated columns supported by extensive cavalry screens and mobile artillery, overwhelmed Parthian defensive positions and captured a series of fortified cities that controlled key river crossings and trade routes throughout the region. The climax of Roman success came with the capture of Ctesiphon, the Parthian winter capital located on the east bank of the Tigris River, approximately 20 miles southeast of modern Baghdad. The assault on this heavily fortified city, protected by massive walls and defended by the elite units of the Parthian royal guard, required sophisticated siege techniques and sustained combat that tested Roman military capabilities to their limits. The eventual fall of Ctesiphon, achieved through a combination of direct assault and blockade tactics that starved the defenders into submission, represented the most significant Roman victory in the East since the campaigns of Trajan half a century earlier. The psychological impact of Ctesiphon's capture reverberated throughout the Parthian Empire and the broader Near Eastern world, demonstrating that Roman military power remained capable of achieving decisive victories against formidable opponents. The substantial treasury accumulated in the Parthian capital provided immediate financial benefits that helped offset the enormous costs of the Eastern expedition, while the symbolic significance of conquering the enemy's royal seat enhanced Roman prestige throughout the Mediterranean world and strengthened the political position of the dual emperors. However, the very success of Roman arms in Mesopotamia created new strategic challenges and unintended consequences that would soon overshadow military achievements. The returning legions, flushed with victory and laden with Parthian treasure, unknowingly carried with them a devastating plague that would transform the Eastern triumph into a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The disease, likely a virulent strain of smallpox previously unknown in the Mediterranean world, had apparently originated in the densely populated regions of Mesopotamia, where Roman forces had campaigned for months in close contact with local populations. The first symptoms of what would later be called the Antonine Plague appeared among Roman troops during their withdrawal from Mesopotamian territories in late 165 CE. Initial cases characterized by high fever, severe headaches, and the distinctive skin eruptions that gave smallpox its name were initially dismissed by military medical personnel as routine campaign illnesses that commonly affected armies operating in unfamiliar climates. The true severity of the outbreak became apparent only as increasing numbers of soldiers succumbed to the disease and the infection began spreading to civilian populations in Syria and other eastern provinces. The plague's westward progression followed the routes of Roman military units and commercial traffic, creating a pandemic that would ultimately affect every province of the empire and cause demographic catastrophe on a scale not seen since the Great Plagues of classical Athens. Marcus Aurelius, coordinating imperial responses from Rome while managing the complex administrative challenges of dual rule, found himself confronting a crisis that threatened to undermine all the military and political achievements of the Eastern campaigns. The disease that accompanied Roman victory would prove to be a more formidable enemy than the Parthian Empire itself, testing imperial leadership and social resilience in ways that no previous challenge had demanded. The devastating plague that Roman legions had unknowingly carried westward from Mesopotamia reached Rome itself in the spring of 166 CE, transforming the imperial capital from a bustling metropolis of over 1 million inhabitants into a city gripped by terror and death. The disease arrived with a merchant caravan from Antioch, spreading first through the crowded tenements of the Subura district where poor Romans lived in multi-story apartment buildings with inadequate sanitation and ventilation. Within weeks, the distinctive symptoms, high fever, severe headaches, and the characteristic pustular eruptions that covered victims' bodies appeared throughout the city's 14 administrative regions, affecting senators and slaves alike with indiscriminate lethality. Marcus Aurelius confronted this unprecedented public health crisis with the systematic approach that characterized his administration of other imperial challenges. But the scale and nature of the plague defied conventional governmental responses. The emperor established emergency medical stations in public buildings throughout Rome, staffing them with physicians recruited from across the Mediterranean world and supplemented by military medics who had gained experience treating plague victims in the eastern provinces. These facilities, hastily equipped with beds, medical supplies, and funeral pyres, provided basic care for the afflicted while attempting to contain the disease's spread through isolation procedures that proved largely ineffective against such a contagious pathogen. The emperor's personal involvement in plague response efforts demonstrated his commitment to Stoic principles of duty and service, even at considerable personal risk. Marcus regularly visited medical stations, speaking with physicians about treatment methods and observing the care provided to victims from all social classes. His presence in plague-affected areas, despite urgent advice from court physicians and palace officials to maintain safe distance from infected populations, provided visible evidence of imperial concern while boosting morale among medical personnel and civic officials struggling to maintain basic services under catastrophic conditions. The plague's impact on Rome's urban infrastructure created cascading crises that tested the administrative capabilities of imperial government. The death toll among essential workers, including aqueduct maintenance crews, sewer cleaners, and grain distribution personnel, threatened the basic systems that sustained urban life for the capital's massive population. Marcus authorized emergency recruitment of replacement workers from rural areas, offering substantial wage premiums and legal protections to attract volunteers willing to enter the plague-stricken city. These measures, while partially successful in maintaining critical services, could not fully compensate for the loss of experienced personnel who possessed irreplaceable knowledge of Rome's complex infrastructure systems. The economic disruption caused by massive population loss extended far beyond the immediate effects of reduced workforce availability. Entire craft workshops closed when master artisans succumbed to the disease, taking with them specialized knowledge of metalworking, textile production, and other manufacturing processes that supported both local consumption and export trade. The famous pottery workshops of Arretium, which had supplied fine ceramics throughout the Western Mediterranean for generations, virtually ceased production as skilled potters died faster than apprentices could replace them. Similar disruptions affected glass-making centres in Gaul, metalworking facilities in Spain, and textile production throughout the empire's urban centres. Marcus responded to these economic challenges with innovative financial measures that demonstrated both pragmatic flexibility and deep understanding of imperial fiscal management. The emperor authorised the release of substantial funds from the imperial treasury's reserve accounts, accumulated during the peaceful and prosperous years of Antonine rule, to provide emergency assistance to affected communities and industries. Rather than simply distributing money indiscriminately, however, Marcus implemented targeted programs designed to maintain economic stability while encouraging recovery efforts that would restore productive capacity over the long term. The emperor established imperial workshops in regions less affected by the plague, staffing them with surviving craftsmen relocated from devastated urban centres and providing them with tools, raw materials, and guaranteed markets for their products. These facilities, operating under direct imperial supervision, maintained production of essential goods including weapons for military units, agricultural tools for farming communities, and basic household items needed by civilian populations. The program required substantial initial investment, but proved crucial in preventing complete economic collapse in affected regions, while preserving valuable technical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost permanently. Agricultural production, the foundation of the ancient economy, suffered severe disruption as the plague spread from urban centres into rural districts where small farmers and agricultural labourers died, in proportions that left vast estates without adequate workforce. The grain harvest of 167 CE fell dramatically short of normal yields, not only because of reduced labour availability, but also because surviving farmers lacked the draft animals, seed stocks, and agricultural implements necessary for effective cultivation. Marcus addressed this crisis by authorising the imperial government's direct intervention in agricultural markets, purchasing available grain at premium prices while distributing emergency supplies to prevent famine in affected regions. The emperor's agricultural policies included innovative land tenure arrangements designed to maintain cultivation of abandoned estates, while providing opportunities for surviving farmers to expand their operations. Imperial administrators identified productive agricultural land whose owners had died without heirs, offering these properties to capable farmers under favourable lease terms that included provision of necessary equipment and livestock. These arrangements, while departing from traditional Roman property law principles, proved essential for maintaining food production during the demographic catastrophe that had eliminated entire farming families across the empire's rural districts. Natural disasters compounded the challenges facing Marcus's administration as the plague continued its devastating progress throughout the Mediterranean world. The winter of 167 CE brought exceptionally severe weather that caused the Tiber River to freeze solid for the first time in living memory, disrupting river traffic that normally supplied Rome with grain, olive oil, and other essential commodities from upstream agricultural regions. When spring floods followed the harsh winter, the swollen Tiber overflowed its banks and inundated large sections of the city, including the Campus Martius, where important government buildings and military installations were located. The Tiber floods of 167 CE created immediate humanitarian crises that demanded rapid imperial response despite the ongoing plague emergency. Thousands of Romans found themselves homeless as floodwaters destroyed apartment buildings in low-lying districts, while contaminated water supplies increased disease transmission rates in areas where the plague had previously been contained. Marcus personally supervised relief efforts, establishing temporary shelters in public buildings on higher ground, while organising the distribution of clean water, food, and medical supplies to flood victims who had lost their possessions and livelihoods. The emperor's response to the flooding demonstrated his practical understanding of urban engineering and his willingness to invest in long-term infrastructure improvements that would prevent similar disasters in the future. Marcus authorized comprehensive repairs and upgrades to Rome's flood control systems, including the construction of new drainage channels, the reinforcement of existing embankments, and the installation of improved sluice gates that could regulate water flow during periods of high river levels. These projects, supervised by experienced military engineers and funded through special taxation measures, required several years to complete but significantly reduced Rome's vulnerability to future flooding events. The psychological impact of simultaneous plague and natural disasters created social tensions that threatened the stability of imperial authority in ways that purely military or political challenges had never achieved. Rumours spread through these cities' markets and bathhouses that the gods had withdrawn their favour from Rome because of moral corruption or religious neglect, leading to increased participation in mystery cults and foreign religious practices that promised supernatural protection against disease and disaster. Some citizens blamed the plague on divine punishment for Roman aggression against Parthia, while others attributed the catastrophes to the unprecedented power-sharing arrangement between Marcus and Lucius Verus. Marcus addressed these social tensions through a combination of practical measures and carefully crafted public communications that emphasized both imperial competence and divine favour. The emperor increased funding for traditional religious ceremonies while personally participating in public sacrifices and other rituals designed to demonstrate proper reverence for the gods who protected Rome. His appearances at these ceremonies, conducted according to ancient protocols in temples throughout the city, provided visible evidence of imperial piety, while reassuring citizens that their rulers maintained proper relationships with divine powers. The emperor's philosophical approach to the crisis, grounded in Stoic principles of acceptance and rational response to circumstances beyond human control, influenced both his personal conduct and his public messaging during this period of unprecedented challenges. Marcus's private writings from these years reveal his struggle to maintain philosophical equanimity while witnessing suffering on a scale that tested even his disciplined emotional responses. His meditations on the transient nature of human life and the importance of focusing on controllable factors rather than external circumstances provided personal comfort while informing his approach to imperial leadership during the crisis. The plague's impact on military capabilities created strategic vulnerabilities that threatened Roman security along multiple frontiers simultaneously. Legions stationed in plague-affected regions lost substantial portions of their strength as soldiers succumbed to disease at rates that exceeded normal battlefield casualties during active campaigns. The Second Augusta Legion, based in Britain, reported losing nearly 40% of its effective strength during the winter of 168 CE, while auxiliary units throughout Gaul and Germany suffered similar losses that left frontier defences dangerously undermanned. Marcus responded to these military challenges by implementing emergency recruitment measures that departed significantly from traditional Roman military practices. The emperor authorized the enlistment of volunteers from social classes previously excluded from legionary service, including freedmen and residents of recently conquered territories who had not yet received full Roman citizenship. These new recruits, while lacking the training and experience of traditional legionaries, provided essential manpower for maintaining frontier garrisons, while veteran units recovered from plague losses. The recruitment of gladiators and bandits into regular military units represented one of Marcus's most controversial responses to the military manpower crisis. The emperor authorized provincial governors to offer pardons and military service opportunities to condemned criminals and captured brigands, transforming potential security threats into useful military assets. These irregular units, led by experienced centurions and equipped with standard Roman weapons and armour, proved surprisingly effective in frontier patrol duties while freeing veteran legions for more demanding combat operations. Training programs for new recruits required adaptation to accommodate both the reduced availability of experienced instructors and the diverse backgrounds of emergency volunteers. Military camps throughout the empire established accelerated training courses that focused on essential combat skills and unit discipline, rather than the comprehensive military education traditionally provided to legionary recruits. These programs, while producing soldiers with less thorough preparation than normal standards required, succeeded in maintaining basic military capabilities during the demographic catastrophe that had eliminated many experienced military personnel. The death of Lucius Verus in 169 CE removed Marcus's co-emperor and closest collaborator at the moment when imperial unity and experienced leadership were most crucial for managing the ongoing crisis. Lucius had contracted the plague while returning from his successful eastern campaigns, succumbing to the disease at Altinum in northern Italy while travelling towards Rome for consultations about frontier defence and domestic recovery efforts. His death, occurring after several days of the characteristic fever and skin eruptions that marked plague victims, deprived Marcus of both personal companionship and practical military expertise that had proven invaluable during the dual emperorship. The funeral of Lucius Verus, conducted according to imperial traditions despite the risks posed by large public gatherings during the plague emergency, demonstrated both the continuity of imperial authority and Marcus's personal grief at losing his adoptive brother and longtime friend. The ceremony, held in the Campus Martius with appropriate social distancing measures to minimize disease transmission, included eulogies from senior senators and military commanders who praised Lucius's contributions to Roman victory in the East, while acknowledging the tragic irony that his triumph had inadvertently brought catastrophe to the empire he had served so effectively. Marcus's assumption of sole imperial authority occurred under circumstances that would have challenged even the most experienced ruler, requiring him to coordinate responses to multiple simultaneous crises while maintaining the appearance of confident leadership that imperial legitimacy demanded. The emperor's daily routine during this period involved dawn consultations with medical advisors about plague containment measures, followed by meetings with military commanders regarding frontier defence requirements, economic officials discussing financial responses to demographic collapse, and engineering supervisors coordinating infrastructure repair projects throughout the affected regions. The administrative challenges of sole rule during the crisis period required Marcus to delegate authority more extensively than had been necessary during the dual emperorship, when Lucius had shared the burden of decision-making and policy implementation. The emperor appointed trusted subordinates to manage specific aspects of the emergency response, including Galen of Pergamon as chief medical advisor for plague containment efforts, and experienced generals to coordinate military recruitment and training programs. These appointments, while necessary for effective crisis management, required careful oversight to ensure that delegated authority served imperial interests rather than personal ambitions. As the devastating plague continued to ravage the empire's population centres throughout 169 CE, urgent dispatches began arriving in Rome from the northern frontiers that would force Marcus Aurelius to confront an entirely different category of crisis. The messages, carried by exhausted cavalry messengers who had ridden hard from the Danube fortifications, brought increasingly alarming reports of massive barbarian movements beyond the river frontier. Germanic tribal confederations, apparently emboldened by intelligence regarding the empire's internal difficulties, had begun massing in unprecedented numbers along the northern banks of the Danube. the warbands swelling with warriors from tribes that had never before cooperated in large-scale military operations. The intelligence reports reaching Marcus's council chambers painted a picture of coordinated barbarian planning that suggested a level of strategic thinking previously unknown among the Germanic peoples. The Marcomanni, a powerful confederation based in modern-day Bohemia, had apparently entered into alliance negotiations with the Quadi of modern Slovakia, the Iazyges Sarmatians from the Hungarian plain, and numerous smaller tribes whose territories stretched from the headwaters of the Danube to the shores of the Baltic Sea. These negotiations, conducted through elaborate diplomatic ceremonies involving the exchange of hostages and ritual weapons, had produced military agreements that could potentially field combined forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Roman intelligence network along the frontier, maintained through a combination of auxiliary scouts, friendly tribal contacts, and merchant informants, provided detailed information about the barbarian preparations that revealed the scope of the threat facing the northern provinces. Germanic smiths had been working throughout the summer months to produce weapons and armour for the expanding warbands, while tribal leaders conducted recruitment drives that drew young warriors from agricultural settlements throughout the Trans-Danubian regions. The barbarians had also been stockpiling food supplies and constructing river-crossing equipment, including large boats capable of transporting cavalry horses and siege equipment across the Danube's swift current. The catalyst for barbarian aggression appeared to be a combination of internal pressures within Germanic society and opportunistic assessment of Roman weaknesses revealed by the ongoing plague crisis. Successive poor harvests in the Trans-Danubian regions had created food shortages that drove desperate populations to consider military solutions for their economic difficulties. Simultaneously, the visible reduction in Roman frontier garrison strength as plague losses decimated auxiliary units and legionary detachments suggested to barbarian leaders that the empire's legendary military superiority might be temporarily vulnerable to coordinated assault. The first major barbarian incursion occurred in late autumn 169 CE, when a combined force of Marcomanni and Quadi warriors crossed the Danube near the Roman fortress of Carnuntum, overwhelming the reduced garrison and establishing a fortified bridgehead on the southern bank of the river. The attack, launched during a moonless night when Roman sentries had difficulty detecting the approaching boats, achieved complete tactical surprise and resulted in the destruction of 2 auxiliary cohorts that had been stationed to guard the crossing point. The barbarian success at Carnuntum opened a gap in the frontier defences that allowed additional warbands to pour across the river and begin advancing toward the wealthy cities of Pannonia and Noricum. Marcus Aurelius received news of the Carnuntum disaster while presiding over a Senate session devoted to plague relief measures, and the emperor's immediate response demonstrated both his military acumen and his understanding of the strategic implications of barbarian success. Rather than attempting to coordinate the frontier response from Rome, Marcus recognized that the crisis demanded personal imperial leadership and the commitment of substantial military resources that could only be effectively deployed under direct imperial command. The emperor's decision to assume personal command of the northern campaign represented a fundamental shift from the administrative approach that had characterized his reign to the active military leadership that the crisis demanded. The mobilization of military forces for the northern campaign required Marcus to make difficult strategic decisions about the allocation of resources already strained by plague losses and ongoing commitments in other regions. The emperor authorized the withdrawal of veteran units from the Rhine frontier, despite concerns about Germanic unrest in that region, while ordering the transfer of experienced legionary detachments from Britain and Spain to reinforce the Danubian armies. The 14th Gemina Legion, based at Mogontiacum on the Rhine, received orders for immediate transfer to Pannonia, while substantial auxiliary forces from Gaul and Britain prepared for deployment to the threatened northern provinces. The logistical challenges of assembling and supplying a major expeditionary force during the ongoing plague emergency tested the administrative capabilities of the imperial government to their limits. Military supply depots throughout the northern provinces had been depleted by the need to support increased garrison requirements, while the transportation network that normally moved supplies and reinforcements had been disrupted by plague-related workforce shortages. Marcus personally supervised the coordination of supply efforts, working with experienced quartermasters and provincial administrators to ensure that advancing Roman forces would have adequate provisions, weapons, and medical supplies for sustained campaigning in hostile territory. The emperor's decision to establish his field headquarters at Aquileia, the prosperous commercial city located at the head of the Adriatic Sea, reflected both strategic and practical considerations that would influence the conduct of the entire northern campaign. Aquileia's location provided excellent communications with Rome while offering convenient access to the Alpine passes that connected Italy with the Danubian provinces. The city's substantial commercial infrastructure, including warehouses, workshops, and harbour facilities, could support the massive logistical requirements of a major military expedition, while providing secure bases for the imperial staff and accompanying administrative personnel. The transformation of Aquileia into an imperial military headquarters required extensive modifications to the city's infrastructure and the establishment of new facilities designed to support extended campaigning operations. Military engineers constructed additional barracks for the imperial guard units that accompanied Marcus, while expanding existing workshops to produce the specialized equipment needed for siege warfare and frontier defense. The emperor's personal quarters, established in a commandeered mansion belonging to a wealthy merchant family, became the nerve center for strategic planning and coordination, with field commanders operating along the extended Danubian frontier. Marcus's approach to the barbarian crisis reflected his philosophical training and systematic temperament, emphasizing careful intelligence gathering and methodical preparation rather than the immediate aggressive response that some military advisors recommended. The emperor established comprehensive intelligence networks that extended deep into barbarian territory, using a combination of auxiliary scouts, diplomatic contacts, and merchant informants to gather detailed information about enemy capabilities, intentions, and internal divisions that might be exploited through diplomatic or military means. These intelligence operations, coordinated by experienced officers who had served in previous frontier campaigns, provided crucial information about barbarian leadership structures and strategic planning that informed Roman tactical decisions. The diplomatic dimension of Marcus's response to the barbarian threat demonstrated his understanding that military solutions alone could not address the underlying causes of Germanic aggression or provide long-term security for the northern frontiers. The emperor authorized negotiations with tribal leaders who had not yet committed to the anti-Roman coalition, offering subsidies, trade privileges, and territorial concessions designed to prevent the further expansion of barbarian alliances. These diplomatic initiatives, conducted through experienced interpreters and backed by carefully calibrated displays of Roman military strength, succeeded in detaching several smaller tribes from the Marcomannic Confederation while providing intelligence about barbarian strategic planning. The winter of 169-170 CE brought unprecedented barbarian advances that carried Germanic warbands across the Alps and into northern Italy itself, creating panic in Roman cities that had not faced foreign invasion for over 2 centuries. The Marcomanni and Quadi, reinforced by Sarmatian cavalry units whose mobility allowed them to outflank Roman defensive positions, penetrated as far south as Opitergium, less than 50 miles from Aquileia, where Marcus had established his headquarters. The barbarian advance threatened not only the emperor's personal safety, but also the psychological foundation of Roman security that had been based on the assumption that Italy itself remained inviolable to foreign attack. The siege of Aquileia during the early months of 170 CE tested both Marcus's personal courage and his strategic judgment as barbarian forces surrounded the city and attempted to capture the emperor himself. The siege, conducted by a combined force estimated at over 50,000 warriors, employed sophisticated tactics that revealed the extent of barbarian military development since their previous conflicts with Roman forces. Germanic engineers constructed siege towers and battering rams that demonstrated knowledge of Roman military techniques, while Sarmatian cavalry units maintained a tight blockade that prevented relief forces from reaching the besieged city. Marcus's conduct during the siege demonstrated the Stoic principles that had guided his philosophical development, while revealing practical leadership skills that had been largely theoretical during his previous administrative career. The emperor personally inspected the city's defensive preparations, speaking with individual soldiers and civilian volunteers who manned the walls while maintaining the calm demeanour that inspired confidence among defenders who faced seemingly overwhelming odds. His presence on the battlements during barbarian assaults, despite urgent pleas from his bodyguards to remain in secure locations, provided visible evidence of imperial courage that became legendary among the troops who witnessed his behaviour under extreme danger. The composition of Marcus's meditations began during these months of siege and campaign, as the emperor sought to maintain philosophical perspective, while confronting the immediate realities of warfare and the broader challenges facing the empire. The emperor's private writings, composed in Greek during quiet moments between military conferences and battlefield inspections, revealed his ongoing struggle to reconcile Stoic ideals with the practical necessities of military command and imperial leadership. These philosophical reflections, never intended for publication, provided personal guidance for maintaining ethical principles while making decisions that involved the deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The emperor's meditative writings during the Aquileia siege included profound reflections on the nature of duty, the acceptance of mortality, and the proper response to circumstances beyond individual control. Marcus's observations about the transient nature of human achievement and the importance of focusing on virtue rather than external success provided psychological comfort during moments when the survival of the empire itself appeared uncertain. His philosophical discipline, maintained through daily meditation and study despite the constant pressures of military crisis, demonstrated the practical value of Stoic training for leaders facing extreme challenges. The relief of Aquileia came through a coordinated assault by Roman forces that had been assembled from garrisons throughout northern Italy, and reinforcements rushed from other provinces. The 10th Gemina Legion, transferred from Spain with remarkable speed, arrived at the crucial moment when barbarian forces had begun preparing for a final assault on the city's weakened defences. The Roman counterattack, launched at dawn with the emperor personally leading elements of the Praetorian Guard, caught the besieging barbarians by surprise and inflicted heavy casualties that forced their withdrawal across the Alps. The successful defence of Aquileia marked a turning point in both the immediate military crisis and Marcus's development as a military commander. The emperor's personal courage during the siege had earned the respect of professional soldiers who had initially questioned whether a philosopher-emperor could provide effective battlefield leadership. More importantly, the experience of commanding troops under combat conditions provided Marcus with practical knowledge of military realities that informed his subsequent strategic decisions and his understanding of the human costs of warfare. The barbarian withdrawal from Italy provided Marcus with an opportunity to reorganize Roman forces and develop comprehensive strategies for addressing the underlying causes of Germanic aggression. The emperor recognized that defensive measures alone could not provide long-term security for the northern frontiers, requiring instead a combination of military action, diplomatic initiatives, and systematic reforms that would address both immediate threats and the structural weaknesses that had allowed barbarian penetration of imperial territory. The strategic innovations that Marcus implemented during the early phases of the Marcomannic Wars reflected both his systematic approach to problem solving and his willingness to adapt traditional Roman military practices to meet new challenges. The emperor authorized the construction of forward operating bases beyond the Danube frontier, establishing fortified positions that could support offensive operations while providing secure supply depots for extended campaigning in barbarian territory. These installations, built by military engineers using techniques developed during previous frontier wars, created a network of mutually supporting strongpoints that extended Roman military presence deep into previously uncontrolled regions. The complex negotiations that Marcus conducted with various barbarian groups demonstrated his understanding that military victory alone could not provide lasting solutions to frontier security problems. The emperor's diplomatic initiatives included not only traditional subsidies and trade agreements, but also innovative arrangements for barbarian settlement within imperial territory under controlled conditions that could benefit both Roman security needs and Germanic population pressures. These negotiations, conducted through experienced interpreters and supported by careful intelligence about tribal politics, succeeded in dividing the barbarian coalition while providing Rome with valuable auxiliary forces recruited from former enemies. The emperor's approach to barbarian relations reflected sophisticated understanding of the cultural and economic factors that drove Germanic aggression against Roman territories. Marcus recognized that population growth, agricultural pressures, and internal tribal conflicts created conditions that made warfare attractive to barbarian leaders seeking solutions to domestic problems. The imperial response included not only military deterrence, but also economic opportunities and political arrangements that could channel barbarian energies in directions that served Roman interests, while addressing legitimate Germanic needs for land and resources. The integration of barbarian auxiliaries into Roman military units required careful attention to training, equipment, and command structures that could maintain military effectiveness while managing potential loyalty problems. Marcus authorized the creation of specialized auxiliary units that combined Germanic warriors with Roman officers and equipment, creating hybrid formations that utilized barbarian knowledge of local terrain and tactics while maintaining Roman discipline and strategic coordination. These experimental units, while initially viewed with suspicion by traditional Roman commanders, proved highly effective in frontier warfare and became models for subsequent military reforms. The development of new frontier defense concepts during the Marcomannic Wars reflected Marcus's systematic analysis of the strategic challenges facing the empire's extended borders. The emperor recognized that traditional linear defense systems, based on fortified boundaries and static garrisons, could not effectively counter the mobility and numerical superiority that barbarian confederations could achieve through coordinated action. The Roman response included the development of defense-in-depth strategies that relied on multiple defensive lines, mobile reserve forces, and rapid communication systems that could concentrate superior force at threatened points while maintaining overall frontier security. The spring of 175 CE brought Marcus Aurelius his first taste of victory in the grueling northern campaigns, when the combined forces of Marcomanni and Quadi finally agreed to comprehensive peace terms that promised to stabilize the Danubian frontier. The emperor, now 53 years old with silver threading through his brown beard and deep lines etched around his eyes from years of campaign stress, had spent the winter months at his forward headquarters near Sirmium, meticulously negotiating the complex arrangements that would resettle displaced barbarian populations while securing Roman territorial integrity. The peace negotiations required extraordinary patience as Germanic tribal councils debated terms through elaborate ceremonial procedures that could extend discussions for weeks, but Marcus understood that lasting agreements demanded respect for barbarian political traditions rather than simple Roman dictation of surrender terms. The emperor's satisfaction with the northern settlement proved tragically short-lived when a dust-covered messenger arrived at Sirmium in early April bearing devastating news from the eastern provinces. The dispatch, written on papyrus in the hurried script of a military secretary, contained intelligence that would transform Marcus's moment of triumph into one of the gravest crises of his reign. Lucius Avidius Cassius, the capable general who had achieved spectacular success during the Parthian campaigns and subsequently served as governor of Syria, had proclaimed himself emperor in Antioch and secured the allegiance of the wealthy eastern provinces that formed the empire's most lucrative source of tax revenue. The initial reports reaching Marcus suggested that Avidius Cassius had acted upon receiving false information about the emperor's death during the northern campaigns. The rumours, apparently originating from garbled accounts of a serious illness that had indeed afflicted Marcus during the harsh winter months, had spread through the eastern provinces with the speed and distortion typical of long-distance communication in the ancient world. Syrian merchants, Egyptian grain traders, and Anatolian provincial officials had apparently accepted the reports as factual, creating conditions that made Cassius's proclamation appear to be a legitimate response to imperial succession crisis, rather than treasonous rebellion against a living emperor. Avidius Cassius possessed both the military credentials and provincial support necessary to pose a genuine threat to Marcus's imperial authority. The Syrian governor had earned widespread respect throughout the eastern provinces through his effective administration during the plague years, when his energetic response to the demographic catastrophe had maintained essential services and economic stability, while other regions struggled with governmental collapse. His military reputation, established during the successful campaigns that had captured Ctesiphon and restored Roman prestige in Mesopotamia, commanded loyalty among the legions stationed throughout Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor that formed the backbone of eastern frontier defence. The scope of Cassius's support became apparent as additional intelligence reached Marcus throughout April and May 175 CE. The prefect of Egypt, Calvisius Stasianus, had immediately recognised Cassius's imperial claim and ordered the province's substantial grain reserves to be placed at the disposal of the new Eastern Emperor. The wealthy cities of Asia Minor, including Ephesus and Pergamon, had sent delegations offering financial support and military assistance to Cassius's cause. Most significantly, several legionary commanders had transferred their allegiance to the Syrian governor, providing him with experienced military forces that could potentially challenge any expedition Marcus might organise to restore eastern loyalty. The rebellion presented Marcus with strategic challenges that differed fundamentally from the barbarian invasions he'd been fighting along the northern frontiers, where Germanic tribes could be defeated through superior Roman military organisation and equipment. Avidius Cassius commanded professional Roman legions equipped with identical weapons and trained in the same tactical methods that Marcus's own forces employed. The eastern rebels possessed secure bases in heavily fortified cities, control over vital sea routes that connected the Mediterranean's eastern and western regions, and access to the enormous wealth generated by Egyptian agriculture and Asian commerce that could sustain prolonged military operations. Marcus's initial response to news of the Eastern Rebellion demonstrated the philosophical principles that had guided his approach to previous crises, emphasizing measured deliberation over immediate emotional reaction. Rather than ordering the immediate execution of Cassius's family members and supporters in Rome, as previous emperors might have done, Marcus chose to treat the rebellion as a misunderstanding that could potentially be resolved through negotiation and clemency rather than violence. The emperor's Stoic training had taught him that anger and vengeance, while natural human responses to betrayal, rarely produced optimal outcomes in complex political situations that required careful analysis of underlying causes and long-term consequences. The emperor's clemency extended to Cassius's wife and children, who remained in Rome under what amounted to protective custody rather than imprisonment. Marcus personally assured the family that they would not be harmed regardless of the rebellion's outcome, a gesture that shocked court officials accustomed to the brutal reprisals that typically accompanied imperial succession disputes. The emperor's restraint reflected both his philosophical commitment to justice over vengeance and his practical understanding that excessive brutality towards rebels' families could drive wavering supporters into permanent opposition by convincing them that surrender offered no hope of survival. Marcus's strategic response to the Eastern Rebellion required careful coordination between immediate military preparations and longer-term diplomatic initiatives designed to undermine Cassius's support base. The emperor recognized that purely military solutions to the crisis would be enormously costly in both human and financial terms, potentially requiring years of campaigning that would leave the northern frontiers vulnerable to renewed barbarian aggression. Instead, Marcus chose to combine limited military pressure with systematic efforts to convince eastern provincial elites that their interests lay with the legitimate emperor rather than with a usurper whose ultimate success remained highly uncertain. The diplomatic campaign that Marcus launched to counter Cassius's rebellion demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics that governed provincial loyalty throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The emperor's agents, operating through established networks of merchants, philosophers, and administrative personnel, carried carefully crafted messages emphasizing Marcus's continued vitality and his commitment to the policies that had brought prosperity to the eastern provinces. These communications included detailed accounts of the emperor's recent military successes against the northern barbarians, providing concrete evidence that reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated. The emperor's decision to journey personally to the eastern provinces represented a calculated risk that demonstrated both political courage and strategic insight. Marcus understood that his physical presence in the contested regions would provide irrefutable proof of his survival while allowing him to personally address the concerns and grievances that had made Cassius's rebellion possible. The imperial journey would also enable Marcus to assess the loyalty of provincial governors, military commanders, and urban elites whose support would be crucial for restoring stable administration throughout the eastern territories. The preparations for Marcus's eastern expedition required complex arrangements that balanced the need for impressive imperial display with practical considerations of military security and administrative continuity. The emperor's travelling party included substantial elements of the Praetorian Guard, whose purple-cloaked horsemen and polished armour would provide visible symbols of imperial authority, along with experienced administrators capable of conducting the detailed negotiations necessary for restoring provincial loyalty. The imperial baggage train, stretching for miles along the dusty roads that connected the Danubian frontier with the eastern provinces, carried not only personal equipment and ceremonial regalia, but also substantial quantities of gold coins that could be distributed as donatives to wavering military units and civic leaders. Faustina the Younger's decision to accompany her husband on the dangerous journey to the east reflected both personal devotion and political calculation that recognised the importance of imperial family unity during succession crises. The Empress, now in her mid-30s and bearing the dignified bearing of a woman who had endured multiple pregnancies and the deaths of several children, understood that her presence would demonstrate confidence in the expedition's success while providing opportunities for the personal diplomacy that often proved decisive in winning over provincial elites. Her participation in the Eastern Journey would also allow her to visit the famous philosophical schools and cultural centres of Asia Minor and Egypt that had long attracted her intellectual interests. The imperial couple's journey eastward through the Balkans and Anatolia became a carefully orchestrated demonstration of imperial vitality and continuity that countered Cassius's claims about Marcus's death. At each major city along the route, local officials organised elaborate ceremonies of welcome that included processions, sacrificial offerings, and public distributions of coins bearing the emperor's portrait. These events, attended by thousands of citizens who could personally witness Marcus's obvious health and vigour, generated reports that spread throughout the eastern provinces and undermined the credibility of the false death reports that had initially justified Cassius's rebellion. The emperor's reception in the major cities of Asia Minor revealed the complex loyalties and competing interests that had made the Eastern Rebellion possible, while suggesting strategies for its eventual resolution. In Ephesus, the wealthy merchants and ship owners who dominated the city's politics expressed genuine relief at discovering that Marcus remained alive, though their initial support for Cassius reflected practical concerns about maintaining commercial relationships rather than personal disloyalty to the legitimate emperor. Similar patterns emerged in other commercial centres, where provincial elites had supported the rebellion primarily to avoid economic disruption, rather than from conviction about Cassius's superior qualifications for imperial leadership. The news of Marcus's approach reached Avidius Cassius during the summer months of 175 CE, creating a crisis of confidence within the rebel leadership that ultimately proved fatal to the usurper's cause. Cassius, who had genuinely believed reports of the emperor's death when he proclaimed himself emperor, now faced the impossible choice between continuing a rebellion against a living emperor or attempting to negotiate surrender terms that might preserve his life and position. The Syrian governor's military supporters, particularly the legionary commanders who had transferred their allegiance based on succession necessity rather than personal ambition, began reconsidering their positions as evidence mounted that Marcus remained very much alive and actively campaigning to restore his authority. The collapse of Cassius's rebellion came with stunning suddenness during late July 175 CE, when the usurper was assassinated by his own officers near Antioch. The centurion Antonius, who commanded Cassius's personal bodyguard, apparently concluded that killing the rebel leader offered the best hope for obtaining imperial clemency for himself and his subordinates. The assassination, carried out during a routine military inspection when Cassius was examining frontier fortifications, eliminated the rebellion's central leadership while providing Marcus with an unexpected resolution to the eastern crisis that avoided the enormous costs of prolonged civil warfare. The death of Avidius Cassius created immediate opportunities for Marcus to demonstrate the clemency and reconciliation that had characterized his approach to the rebellion from its inception. Rather than ordering widespread executions or confiscations that might have been expected after such a serious challenge to imperial authority, the emperor issued proclamations of amnesty for most rebel supporters, while emphasizing his desire to restore unity and cooperation throughout the eastern provinces. The measured imperial response reflected both philosophical principle and practical politics, recognizing that harsh reprisals would create lasting resentment among eastern elites, whose cooperation remained essential for effective provincial administration. Marcus's personal examination of Cassius's severed head, presented to him by the centurion who had arranged the assassination, revealed the complex emotions that the rebellion had generated in the philosopher-emperor. Contemporary accounts suggest that Marcus displayed neither satisfaction nor anger upon viewing the physical evidence of his rival's death, instead expressing regret that circumstances had prevented a personal meeting that might have resolved their differences through discussion rather than violence. The emperor's reaction reflected his Stoic conviction that political conflicts should be addressed through reason and compromise, rather than the personal animosity that had characterized many previous imperial succession disputes. The continuation of the eastern journey after Cassius's death served multiple purposes that extended beyond the immediate need to restore provincial loyalty and administrative stability. Marcus's presence in Syria, Egypt, and other eastern territories provided opportunities for the detailed investigation of governmental problems that had contributed to the rebellion's initial success. The emperor's personal meetings with provincial governors, military commanders, and civic leaders revealed systematic issues in eastern administration that required comprehensive reforms rather than simple personnel changes. The tragic death of Faustina the Younger during the eastern journey deprived Marcus of his closest personal companion at the moment when her diplomatic skills and emotional support would have been most valuable for completing the restoration of imperial authority. The Empress, who had maintained her health and energy throughout the demanding travel across Anatolia, suddenly fell ill near the military camp of Halala in Cappadocia during early winter 175 CE. The illness, characterized by high fever and severe abdominal pain, resisted the efforts of the imperial physicians who had accompanied the expedition and proved fatal within a matter of days. Faustina's death created a personal crisis for Marcus that tested his philosophical discipline and emotional resilience in ways that military defeats and political rebellions had never achieved. The emperor, who had maintained stoic composure during years of plague, warfare, and civil unrest, found himself confronting grief that challenged his fundamental beliefs about attachment, loss, and the proper response to circumstances beyond human control. His private writings from this period reveal the depth of his emotional struggle and his efforts to find philosophical consolation for a loss that seemed to undermine the rational acceptance of fate that formed the foundation of Stoic ethics. The imperial funeral arrangements for Faustina demonstrated both Marcus's personal devotion and his understanding of the political importance of honouring the Empress, who had shared the burdens of imperial leadership for over 30 years. The emperor ordered the construction of an elaborate funeral pyre near the camp where Faustina had died, conducting the cremation ceremony according to traditional Roman rituals, while adding personal touches that reflected their long partnership. The distribution of Faustina's ashes among multiple burial sites, including locations in Rome and the eastern provinces where she had died, symbolised the empire-wide scope of her influence and the personal loss that Marcus had suffered. The emperor's establishment of charitable foundations in Faustina's memory reflected both personal grief and practical recognition of the social problems that had contributed to the Eastern Rebellion's initial appeal. The foundations, funded through imperial resources and administered by trusted freedmen, provided assistance to orphaned children, widowed women, and other vulnerable populations, whose suffering during the plague years had created conditions that ambitious provincial governors could exploit for political purposes. These institutions, operating throughout the eastern provinces, served as permanent memorials to the Empress, while addressing the underlying social tensions that threatened imperial stability. The completion of Marcus's eastern journey during the final months of 175 CE achieved the restoration of imperial authority throughout the rebellious provinces, while providing the emperor with detailed knowledge of administrative problems that required systematic attention. The personal meetings that Marcus conducted with hundreds of provincial officials, military officers, and civic leaders revealed the complex web of personal relationships, economic interests, and political loyalties that governed Eastern Mediterranean society. This information proved invaluable for the comprehensive reforms that would be necessary to prevent future rebellions, while maintaining the prosperity and stability that made the eastern provinces so crucial to imperial finances. The emperor's return to Rome in late 175 CE marked not the end of his military burdens, but merely an interlude before confronting the harsh reality that the northern frontiers remained fundamentally unstable despite the previous year's peace agreements. Marcus Aurelius, now bearing the physical toll of years spent in military camps and bearing the emotional weight of Faustina's recent death, found himself facing intelligence reports that suggested the Germanic tribal confederations had used the respite provided by his eastern expedition to rebuild their military capabilities and forge new alliances that threatened to resume hostilities on an even larger scale than before. The winter months of 175-176 CE brought a steady stream of disturbing reports from Danubian frontier commanders who observed increasing barbarian activity across the river boundary. Auxiliary scouts reported large gatherings of Marcomannic warriors in the forests of Bohemia, while Sarmatian cavalry units had been spotted conducting reconnaissance missions along the Roman bank of the Danube. More ominously, intercepted communications between tribal leaders suggested that news of the Avidius Cassius rebellion had convinced Germanic chieftains that the Roman Empire remained internally divided and vulnerable to coordinated assault. The barbarian leaders had apparently concluded that Marcus's temporary absence in the east demonstrated Roman inability to maintain simultaneous pressure on multiple frontiers. The intelligence picture that emerged during early 176 CE revealed that the previous peace agreements had failed to address the fundamental demographic and economic pressures that drove Germanic aggression against Roman territories. The tribal populations beyond the Danube continued to grow at rates that exceeded the carrying capacity of their traditional agricultural lands, while climate changes had apparently reduced crop yields throughout the trans-Danubian regions. These conditions created desperate populations willing to risk everything in military ventures that offered the possibility of seizing Roman agricultural land and urban wealth that could support their expanding numbers. Marcus's response to the deteriorating northern situation reflected both his accumulated experience with barbarian warfare and his philosophical understanding that lasting solutions required addressing root causes rather than merely suppressing symptoms. The emperor authorized a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation that extended deep into Germanic territory, using a network of merchants, diplomatic contacts, and auxiliary scouts to gather detailed information about tribal politics, military capabilities, and internal divisions that might be exploited through diplomatic or military means. This intelligence operation, coordinated by experienced officers who had served throughout the previous campaigns, provided crucial insights into barbarian strategic planning and leadership structures. The emperor's preparations for renewed northern campaigning included significant innovations in military organization and tactical doctrine that reflected lessons learned during the previous conflicts. Marcus authorized the creation of specialized auxiliary units that combined Germanic warriors with Roman officers and equipment, producing hybrid formations that utilize barbarian knowledge of local terrain and tactics while maintaining Roman discipline and strategic coordination. These experimental units, initially viewed with suspicion by traditional Roman commanders, proved highly effective in frontier warfare and became models for subsequent military reforms that would influence imperial defense policy for generations. The logistical preparations for the resumed northern campaigns required Marcus to address the ongoing demographic effects of the plague that had continued to reduce available manpower throughout the empire's military recruitment regions. The emperor implemented emergency conscription measures that extended military service obligations to social classes previously exempt from legionary duty, including urban craftsmen, small farmers, and residents of recently conquered territories who'd not yet received full Roman citizenship. These new recruits, while lacking the training and experience of traditional legionaries, provided essential manpower for maintaining frontier garrisons, while veteran units prepared for offensive operations. The recruitment of gladiators, bandits, and condemned criminals into regular military units represented one of Marcus's most controversial responses to the manpower crisis that continued to affect Roman military capabilities. Provincial governors received authorization to offer pardons and military service opportunities to individuals whose combat experience, though gained through illegal or disreputable means, could prove valuable in frontier warfare. These irregular units, led by experienced centurions and equipped with standard Roman weapons and armour, were assigned to secondary roles that utilised their fighting abilities while minimising potential loyalty problems. The emperor's decision to return personally to the northern frontiers in 176 CE demonstrated his understanding that the barbarian crisis required sustained imperial leadership rather than delegation to subordinate commanders. Marcus established his forward headquarters at Vindobona, a fortified city located at a strategic bend in the Danube, that provided excellent communications with both upstream and downstream Roman positions. The choice of Vindobona reflected careful analysis of geographical factors, as the city's location allowed effective coordination of military operations along the entire middle Danubian frontier, while providing secure supply lines connecting the combat zone with the Italian heartland. The transformation of Vindobona into an imperial military capital required extensive modifications to the city's infrastructure and the establishment of new facilities designed to support extended campaigning operations. Military engineers expanded existing barracks and constructed additional workshops for producing specialized equipment needed for siege warfare and frontier defense. The emperor's personal quarters, established in the city's former governor's palace, became the nerve center for strategic planning and coordination, with field commanders operating along the extended frontier from modern-day Austria to the Black Sea coast. Marcus's approach to the renewed barbarian campaigns reflected his systematic temperament and philosophical training, emphasizing careful preparation and methodical execution, rather than the immediate aggressive response that some military advisors recommended. The emperor spent months during late 176 and early 177 CE conducting detailed planning sessions with his senior commanders, analysing intelligence reports about barbarian capabilities and developing comprehensive strategies that addressed both immediate military threats and longer-term frontier security requirements. These planning sessions, conducted in map-lined chambers within the Vindobona headquarters, produced detailed operational plans that coordinated the activities of multiple legions and auxiliary units across hundreds of miles of contested territory. The diplomatic dimension of Marcus's northern strategy demonstrated his understanding that military solutions alone could not provide lasting security for the Danubian frontier. The emperor authorized complex negotiations with tribal leaders who had not yet committed to anti-Roman coalitions, offering subsidies, trade privileges, and territorial concessions designed to prevent the expansion of barbarian alliances. These diplomatic initiatives, conducted through experienced interpreters and backed by carefully calibrated displays of Roman military strength, succeeded in detaching several smaller tribes from the Marcomannic Confederation, while providing valuable intelligence about barbarian strategic planning. The winter campaign of 178 CE marked a significant departure from traditional Roman military practices, as Marcus authorized sustained operations during the harsh months when armies typically remained in winter quarters. The decision reflected both strategic necessity and tactical innovation, as winter campaigning offered opportunities to attack barbarian settlements when their populations were concentrated in permanent villages rather than dispersed across the landscape in mobile war bands. The logistical challenges of maintaining military operations during the severe Danubian winter required extensive preparation, including the stockpiling of cold weather equipment, specialized food supplies, and medical materials needed to treat frostbite and other winter-related injuries. The emperor's personal participation in winter campaigning operations demonstrated his commitment to sharing the hardships endured by ordinary soldiers while providing visible leadership during the most challenging phases of the northern campaigns. Marcus regularly inspected frontier positions during bitter winter nights, speaking with sentries and patrol leaders while wearing the same heavy woolen cloak and fur-lined boots that protected common legionaries from the elements. His presence at forward observation posts, despite urgent advice from bodyguards to remain in secure locations, provided concrete evidence of imperial courage that became legendary among troops who witnessed his behaviour under extreme conditions. The composition of additional sections of Marcus's meditations continued during these final campaigns, as the emperor sought to maintain philosophical perspective while confronting the immediate realities of warfare and the broader challenges facing the empire. The emperor's private writings from this period, composed in Greek during quiet moments between military conferences and battlefield inspections, revealed his ongoing struggle to reconcile Stoic ideals with the practical necessities of military command and imperial leadership. These philosophical reflections, written on wax tablets and papyrus scraps that could be easily transported in military baggage, provided personal guidance for maintaining ethical principles while making decisions that involved the deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The emperor's meditative writings during the final northern campaigns included profound reflections on mortality, duty, and the proper response to circumstances beyond individual control. Marcus's observations about the transient nature of human achievement and the importance of focusing on virtue rather than external success provided psychological comfort during moments when the survival of Roman civilization itself appeared uncertain. His philosophical discipline, maintained through daily meditation and study despite constant military pressures, demonstrated the practical value of Stoic training for leaders facing extreme challenges that tested both physical endurance and moral resolve. The successful conclusion of major offensive operations during 178 CE achieved significant territorial gains that pushed Roman control beyond the Danube and established permanent military installations deep in previously barbarian territory. The construction of fortified bridgeheads on the northern bank of the river created secure bases for future operations while demonstrating Roman determination to maintain offensive capabilities rather than merely defending existing boundaries. These installations, built by military engineers using techniques developed during previous frontier wars, created a network of mutually supporting strongpoints that extended Roman military presence into regions that had never before been under direct imperial control. The integration of conquered barbarian territories into the imperial administrative system required careful attention to local conditions and customs that differed significantly from traditional Roman provincial organization. Marcus authorized the establishment of military districts governed by experienced officers who possessed both combat experience and administrative capabilities necessary for managing populations that retained many of their traditional social structures and legal practices. These arrangements, while departing from standard provincial administration procedures, proved effective in maintaining order while gradually introducing Roman legal and economic institutions. The question of imperial succession, which had remained largely theoretical during Marcus's earlier reign, became increasingly urgent as the emperor approached his 60th birthday, while continuing to endure the physical hardships of active campaigning. The deaths of several of his sons during childhood had left Commodus as the primary heir, despite the young man's obvious temperamental differences from his philosophically minded father. Marcus's private correspondence from this period reveals his growing concerns about his son's suitability for imperial leadership, particularly Commodus's preference for gladiatorial games and hunting over the administrative and military duties that effective emperorship required. The emperor's decision to elevate Commodus to the rank of Caesar in 177 CE represented a compromise between dynastic necessity and personal misgivings about his son's character and capabilities. The formal ceremony, conducted at Vindobona with appropriate military honours, demonstrated imperial confidence in the succession arrangements, while providing Commodus with official status that would facilitate the transition of power when circumstances eventually required it. The appointment also served practical purposes by giving the young Caesar opportunities to gain experience with military and administrative responsibilities under his father's direct supervision. Commodus's participation in the northern campaigns provided mixed evidence regarding his potential as a future emperor, revealing both natural abilities and troubling character traits that concerned experienced officers and court officials. The young Caesar demonstrated personal courage during combat operations and showed genuine interest in military engineering and siege warfare techniques, but his treatment of prisoners and his enthusiasm for gladiatorial combat raised questions about his judgment and temperament. Marcus's attempts to provide philosophical education for his son met with limited success, as Commodus showed little interest in the Stoic principles that had guided his father's approach to imperial leadership. The emperor's correspondence with prominent philosophers and intellectuals throughout the Mediterranean world during these final years reflected his ongoing commitment to intellectual discourse, despite the demands of military campaigning. Letters exchanged with figures such as Fronto, his former rhetoric teacher, and various Stoic philosophers provided opportunities for discussing theoretical questions about governance, ethics, and the proper relationship between philosophical principles and practical political action. These intellectual exchanges, conducted through the imperial postal system that maintained communications across vast distances, helped sustain Marcus's philosophical development, while providing perspectives from individuals who were not directly involved in military or administrative affairs. The legal and administrative reforms that Marcus implemented during his final years established precedents that would influence Roman governance long after his death, particularly in areas related to the treatment of slaves and the regulation of gladiatorial games. The emperor's legislation strengthened existing protections for slaves against arbitrary punishment, while establishing procedures for investigating complaints about excessive brutality. These measures reflected both humanitarian concerns and practical recognition that slave labour remained essential for imperial economic productivity, requiring legal frameworks that balanced masters' property rights with basic human dignity. The emperor's reforms regarding gladiatorial combat addressed both the enormous financial costs of public entertainment and growing philosophical objections to the moral implications of organised violence for popular amusement. Marcus implemented regulations that reduced the frequency of gladiatorial games, while establishing stricter medical supervision and safety procedures that decreased fatality rates among participants. These reforms, while falling short of abolishing gladiatorial combat entirely, represented significant steps toward reducing the human costs of popular entertainment while maintaining the political benefits that public games provided for imperial legitimacy. The establishment of educational institutions and libraries throughout the empire reflected Marcus's commitment to intellectual development and cultural preservation that extended beyond immediate military and administrative concerns. The emperor authorized the construction of schools and libraries in major provincial cities, staffing them with qualified teachers and providing them with collections of classical texts that preserved Greek and Roman literary heritage. These institutions, funded through imperial resources and local contributions, served as centres for philosophical and scientific education, while strengthening cultural connections between distant provinces and the Italian heartland. The final winter of Marcus's life, spent in the military camp at Vindobona during 179-180 CE, brought both military success and personal decline. As the emperor's health deteriorated under the accumulated stress of years spent in harsh frontier conditions, the successful conclusion of peace negotiations with the major barbarian confederations achieved the territorial and security objectives that had motivated the long northern campaigns, but the physical toll of extended campaigning had weakened the emperor's constitution beyond recovery. Marcus's daily routine during these final months involved morning conferences with military commanders and afternoon sessions devoted to administrative correspondence. But increasing fatigue limited his ability to maintain the intensive schedule that had characterized his earlier years. The emperor's final philosophical writings, composed during quiet evening hours when military duties permitted private reflection, revealed both acceptance of approaching death and continued commitment to the Stoic principles that had guided his entire adult life. Marcus's meditations on mortality and the proper preparation for death demonstrated the practical application of philosophical training to the ultimate human challenge, providing personal comfort while creating literary works that would inspire subsequent generations of readers seeking guidance for confronting their own mortality and the broader challenges of human existence. The bitter winter of 179 180 CE at Vindobona brought an unusual stillness to the military camp that housed the emperor and his staff. Marcus Aurelius, now approaching his 59th birthday, had spent the previous months conducting final negotiations with barbarian chieftains, while managing the complex administrative details required to integrate newly conquered territories into the imperial system. The successful conclusion of peace agreements with the Marcomanni and Quadi had achieved the strategic objectives that had motivated years of grueling frontier warfare, but the physical toll of extended campaigning in harsh conditions had steadily weakened the emperor's health throughout the autumn months. The emperor's daily routine during these final months retained the systematic approach that had characterized his entire reign, though observers noted his increasing fatigue and the deliberate pace with which he moved through his administrative duties. Marcus continued to rise before dawn for philosophical meditation and correspondence review, followed by morning conferences with military commanders and afternoon sessions devoted to judicial appeals and provincial administration. His evening hours, once filled with additional administrative work or philosophical writing, were increasingly devoted to rest as his body struggled to recover from the accumulated stress of nearly 2 decades of imperial leadership. The symptoms of Marcus's final illness began manifesting in early February 180 CE, with persistent stomach pains and digestive difficulties that initially appeared to be routine campaign ailments, common among soldiers living on military rations in cold conditions. The emperor's personal physicians, led by experienced Greek doctors who had accompanied the imperial household throughout the northern campaigns, prescribed traditional treatments including herbal remedies and dietary modifications that provided temporary relief but failed to address the underlying condition that was gradually undermining his strength. As February progressed into March, Marcus's condition deteriorated despite the careful attention of his medical staff and the prayers offered by military chaplains throughout the Danubian army. The emperor's appetite declined significantly, while persistent fever and weakness made it increasingly difficult for him to maintain the demanding schedule of meetings and administrative tasks that imperial leadership required. Court officials began making discreet preparations for the possibility of imperial transition, though Marcus continued to conduct essential business from his quarters within the fortified compound at Vindobona. The emperor's approach to his declining health reflected the Stoic principles that had guided his entire adult life, accepting the physical deterioration with philosophical composure, while focusing his remaining energy on completing essential governmental tasks and ensuring smooth succession arrangements. Marcus spent considerable time during his final weeks reviewing administrative procedures with trusted subordinates, providing detailed guidance for managing the transition period that would follow his death. His instructions emphasized continuity of policy and the importance of maintaining the peace agreements that had been negotiated with such difficulty along the northern frontiers. Commodus's presence at Vindobona during his father's final illness provided opportunities for last-minute guidance regarding the responsibilities and challenges that would accompany imperial authority. The 19-year-old heir apparent had participated in the northern campaigns with mixed success, demonstrating personal courage in combat situations, while showing less enthusiasm for the administrative and diplomatic aspects of imperial leadership. Marcus's conversations with his son during these final weeks, conducted in the privacy of the imperial quarters, apparently focused on practical advice about managing the complex coalition of advisors, generals, and administrators whose cooperation would be essential for effective governance. The emperor's final philosophical writings, composed during brief periods when his strength permitted such intellectual activity, revealed both acceptance of approaching death and continued commitment to the rational analysis of human experience that had characterized his mature thought. These last meditations, written on wax tablets that could be easily handled despite his physical weakness, included reflections on the cyclical nature of life and death, the importance of virtue over external circumstances, and the proper attitude toward mortality that Stoic philosophy recommended for individuals facing their final transition. Marcus Aurelius died on the morning of March 17, 180 CE, in his quarters at the military camp of Vindobona, surrounded by his son Commodus, senior military commanders, and court officials who had served him throughout the northern campaigns. The emperor's death came peacefully after several days of increasing weakness, with contemporary accounts describing his final hours as marked by the same composed dignity that had characterized his approach to the challenges of imperial leadership. His last recorded words, according to court historians, emphasized concern for the welfare of his soldiers and the importance of maintaining the frontier peace that had cost so much effort to achieve. The immediate aftermath of Marcus's death revealed the effectiveness of succession planning that had been developed over several years of preparation for this inevitable transition. Commodus's acclamation as emperor by the assembled legions at Vindobona proceeded smoothly, with veteran centurions and auxiliary commanders expressing loyalty to the new ruler while maintaining the disciplined order that characterized Roman military culture. The formal ceremonies of imperial transition, conducted according to established protocols despite the frontier setting, demonstrated the institutional strength that had enabled the Roman system to survive numerous changes of leadership over the previous 2 centuries. The transportation of Marcus's body from Vindobona to Rome required elaborate arrangements that balanced the need for appropriate imperial honours with practical considerations of preserving the corpse during the lengthy journey across the Alps and through northern Italy. Military engineers constructed a specially designed funeral wagon equipped with refrigeration systems using snow and ice, while cavalry escorts provided security for the procession that would carry the dead emperor through provinces where his personal presence had been crucial for maintaining stability during years of crisis and warfare. The imperial funeral conducted in Rome during late March 180 CE demonstrated both the genuine affection that Marcus had earned from the Roman people and the political importance of maintaining ceremonial continuity during imperial transitions. The elaborate procession through the city's streets drew enormous crowds of citizens who had benefited from the emperor's careful administration during the Plague years and his successful defence of the empire against barbarian invasion. The funeral pyre, constructed in the Campus Martius according to traditional designs, but enhanced with architectural elements that reflected Marcus's philosophical interests, provided a fitting conclusion to the life of the emperor, whom many contemporaries already recognized as exceptional among Roman rulers. Commodus's early reign quickly revealed the dramatic differences in temperament and priorities that distinguished the new emperor from his philosophically minded father. Where Marcus had approached imperial leadership as a burden to be borne for the benefit of others, Commodus viewed imperial authority primarily as an opportunity for personal gratification and the pursuit of interests that had little connection to effective governance. The young emperor's immediate abandonment of the northern frontier campaigns, despite the incomplete nature of territorial consolidation that Marcus had considered essential for long-term security, demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of the strategic challenges facing the empire. The rapid deterioration of imperial administration under Commodus's leadership vindicated the concerns that Marcus had privately expressed about his son's suitability for imperial responsibility. Within months of his accession, Commodus had delegated most governmental functions to favourites and freedmen whose primary qualifications were personal loyalty, rather than administrative competence. The emperor's obsession with gladiatorial combat, which led him to participate personally in arena contests, while neglecting essential governmental duties, shocked senators and provincial administrators who had grown accustomed to Marcus's systematic approach to imperial leadership. The abandonment of Marcus's frontier policies created immediate security problems that would plague the empire for generations. Commodus's decision to withdraw Roman forces from the advanced positions beyond the Danube that his father had established at enormous cost eliminated the strategic advantages that had been gained through years of difficult campaigning. The barbarian tribes that had been contained through careful combinations of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation quickly recognized the changed circumstances and began preparing for renewed aggression against territories that they had previously been forced to respect. The contrast between father and son became even more pronounced in domestic policy areas, where Marcus had implemented careful reforms designed to improve imperial administration and strengthen legal protections for vulnerable populations. Commodus showed little interest in judicial appeals, administrative efficiency, or the humanitarian concerns that had motivated many of his father's legislative initiatives. The systematic approach to governmental problems that had characterized the Antonine period gave way to impulsive decision-making and favoritism that undermined the institutional foundations of effective imperial administration. The historical assessment of Marcus Aurelius's reign began forming almost immediately after his death, as contemporary observers recognized the exceptional nature of his leadership during a period of unprecedented challenges. Cassius Dio, the centurion historian who lived through the transition from Marcus to Commodus, wrote extensively about the contrast between the emperor's careful attention to governmental responsibilities and his son's immediate abandonment of effective administrative practices. Dio's account, based on personal observation and access to official records, emphasized Marcus's unique combination of intellectual depth and practical competence that had enabled him to manage simultaneous crises that might have overwhelmed less capable rulers. The Historia Augusta, compiled during the later imperial period from various contemporary sources, provided detailed accounts of Marcus's character and achievements that emphasized his philosophical training and moral integrity. These biographical sketches, while sometimes embellished with legendary material, preserved authentic information about the emperor's daily routines, his approach to judicial matters, and his personal conduct during military campaigns that demonstrated the practical application of Stoic principles to imperial leadership. The Historia. Augusta's portrait of Marcus as the ideal philosopher-ruler established interpretive frameworks that would influence historical assessments for centuries. Byzantine chroniclers of the medieval period, writing from the perspective of the Eastern Empire that considered itself the continuation of Roman imperial tradition, consistently ranked Marcus Aurelius among the greatest emperors in Roman history. Writers such as John Zanarus and Michael Psellus emphasized his successful defense of the empire against barbarian invasion and his maintenance of internal stability during the devastating plague that had threatened to destroy Roman civilization. These Byzantine assessments, while sometimes lacking detailed knowledge of Western developments, recognized Marcus's achievements in preserving imperial unity during crises that had tested the fundamental resilience of Roman institutions. The enduring influence of Marcus's meditations on Western philosophical and political thought began during the Renaissance period, when humanist scholars rediscovered Greek manuscripts containing the emperor's private reflections. The personal nature of these writings, never intended for publication, provided readers with unprecedented insight into the mind of a ruler who had wielded absolute power while maintaining commitment to ethical principles and rational analysis of human experience. The Meditations offered practical guidance for individuals facing moral dilemmas and personal challenges, while demonstrating how philosophical training could inform decision-making in complex political situations. The political philosophy implicit in Marcus's Meditations influenced Enlightenment thinkers who were developing theories about the proper relationship between governmental authority and individual rights. Philosophers such as John Stuart Mill and political theorists throughout Europe found in Marcus's writings evidence that absolute power could be exercised with restraint and wisdom when rulers possessed appropriate intellectual and moral preparation. The concept of enlightened leadership that emerged from these discussions drew heavily on the model provided by Marcus's reign, though later democratic theorists questioned whether individual virtue could provide sufficient safeguards against the abuse of concentrated political authority. The influence of Marcus Aurelius on modern conceptions of leadership extends far beyond academic political theory to include practical applications in business management, military command, and public administration. The emperor's systematic approach to problem-solving, his emphasis on careful consultation with experts, and his commitment to making decisions based on rational analysis rather than emotional impulses have become standard elements in leadership training programs throughout the contemporary world. His personal example of sharing hardships with subordinates while maintaining ultimate responsibility for organizational success provides a model that remains relevant for leaders in various institutional contexts. The literary influence of the Meditations has inspired countless readers seeking guidance for confronting personal challenges and moral dilemmas that transcend the specific historical circumstances of 2nd century Rome. The emperor's reflections on mortality, duty, and the proper response to circumstances beyond individual control offer timeless wisdom that speaks to fundamental human experiences, regardless of cultural or temporal context. The accessibility of Marcus's philosophical language, written for personal clarification rather than academic display, has made Stoic principles available to general audiences who might find formal philosophical treatises intimidating or irrelevant to practical concerns. Modern historical scholarship has confirmed many of the positive assessments of Marcus's reign that originated with contemporary observers, while providing more detailed analysis of the complex challenges that he successfully managed during his 19 years of imperial leadership. Archaeological evidence from frontier excavations has revealed the sophisticated engineering and logistical planning that supported his military campaigns, while papyrus documents from Egypt and other provinces demonstrate the careful attention to administrative detail that maintained governmental effectiveness during periods of crisis. These discoveries have reinforced appreciation for Marcus's practical competence, while providing concrete evidence for the systematic approach that characterized his imperial administration. The demographic studies of the Antonine Plague's impact have revealed the unprecedented scale of the crisis that Marcus confronted during the middle years of his reign, with population losses in some regions approaching levels that threatened the fundamental viability of urban civilization. The emperor's success in maintaining essential governmental functions and economic stability during this catastrophe demonstrates administrative capabilities that few rulers in any historical period have been required to display. The recovery programs that he implemented established precedents for disaster response that influenced imperial policy for generations while providing models for governmental intervention during demographic emergencies. The military historian's analysis of the Marcomannic Wars has highlighted the innovative strategies and tactical adaptations that Marcus developed for confronting barbarian threats that differed significantly from traditional Roman military challenges. His integration of Germanic auxiliary forces, his development of winter campaign techniques, and his systematic approach to frontier fortification created military innovations that influenced Roman defensive policy throughout the later imperial period. The success of these adaptations in containing barbarian penetration while establishing secure territorial boundaries demonstrated strategic thinking that went far beyond conventional military responses to frontier threats. The constitutional implications of Marcus's dual emperorship with Lucius Verus have attracted scholarly attention as an early example of power-sharing arrangements that would become increasingly common during the later imperial period. The successful coordination of authority between co-emperors with different areas of expertise provided a model for managing the administrative burdens that had grown beyond the capacity of individual rulers to handle effectively. While the experiment ended with Lucius's death, the precedent established by their collaboration influenced subsequent arrangements for dividing imperial responsibilities among multiple rulers. The legal historian's examination of Marcus's judicial reforms has revealed the humanitarian principles that guided his approach to legislation affecting slaves, gladiators, and other vulnerable populations within Roman society. His strengthening of legal protections against arbitrary punishment and his establishment of appeal procedures that provided recourse for individuals claiming injustice represented significant advances in the development of Roman jurisprudence. These legal innovations influenced subsequent imperial legislation, while establishing precedents that contributed to the gradual evolution of more humane legal standards throughout the Mediterranean world. The economic analysis of Marcus's fiscal policies during the plague and warfare crises has demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of imperial finances that enabled him to fund massive military expenditures and disaster relief programs without destroying the currency or creating unsustainable debt burdens. His careful management of imperial resources, combined with innovative taxation measures and strategic use of reserve funds, maintained economic stability during circumstances that might have caused financial collapse under less competent leadership. The fiscal precedents established during his reign influenced imperial economic policy for centuries, while providing models for managing governmental resources during extended emergencies. The philosophical legacy of Marcus Aurelius extends beyond the direct influence of his written works to include the broader example of how intellectual training can inform practical leadership in complex institutional settings. His demonstration that philosophical reflection and systematic ethical analysis could coexist with effective decision-making in military and administrative contexts challenged assumptions about the relationship between contemplative and active life that had persisted since classical antiquity. The integration of philosophical wisdom with practical competence that characterized his reign established a model of enlightened leadership that continues to influence contemporary discussions about the proper preparation for positions of significant responsibility. The death of Marcus Aurelius on March 17th, 180 CE, marked not only the end of an exceptional individual life, but also the conclusion of the Pax Romana and the golden age of Antonine prosperity that had characterized the 2nd century. His reign represented the culmination of Roman imperial achievement, demonstrating how traditional governmental institutions could adapt to unprecedented challenges while maintaining the essential characteristics that had made Roman civilization a unifying force throughout the Mediterranean world. The philosopher-emperor's legacy endures as a testament to the possibility of combining absolute power with moral restraint, intellectual depth with practical effectiveness, and personal virtue with public service in ways that elevated both the individual ruler and the civilization he served.